My husband of 15 years left me for his younger colleague, then moved her into what they thought was his dream home. But when they invited me to dinner to flaunt their perfect life, his new wife discovered the truth about who really owned the mansion they were living in, and their smug smiles vanished in an instant. The evening air was crisp with early autumn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carrying the scent of pine and expensive perfume through the open French doors of the sprawling Victorian mansion. Crystal. Glasses clinked amid polite laughter as waitstaff in pressed uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The golden glow from antique chandeliers bathed everything in warm light, highlighting the ornate moldings and original hardwood floors that had made me fall in love with this house 5 years ago. I stood at the edge of the party, my fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of my untouched champagne flute, wondering what cruel impulse had possessed Richard to invite me here tonight. 15 years of marriage, dissolved in a text message 6 months ago, and now this. An invitation to the housewarming party for what he kept calling our dream home in the series of emails I'd initially ignored. There she is. The woman of the hour finally decided to grace us with her presence. Richard's voice cut through the ambient chatter, deliberately loud enough to draw attention. Several heads turned toward me, curious eyes assessing the ex-wife who had dared to show up. He approached with his arm wrapped possessively around the waist of Vanessa, the marketing director 20 years his junior who had been his, just a, colleague. Until she wasn't. "Julia," he said, his smile tight and eyes gleaming with something that looked like triumph. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I almost didn't," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. But curiosity got the better of me. Vanessa's smile was practiced and perfect, matching her immaculate appearance, designer dress, salon-fresh highlights, and jewelry that screamed new money. "We're so glad you could make it," she said, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. Richard thought it was important to, how did you put it, darling? Maintain civilized relations. Richard's laugh was too loud. Something like that. Besides, I wanted you to see what we've done with the place. Remember how you always said this house had untapped potential? The barb was intentional. During our marriage, we'd looked at this very house when it first went on the market, and I'd fallen in love with its history and character. Richard had dismissed it as too much work and a money pit, opting instead for a modern penthouse downtown. Yet here he was, hosting a party in the very home he'd once rejected, with the woman he'd left me for. The renovations are lovely. I managed, taking a sip of champagne to hide whatever emotion might be showing on my face. Vanessa has quite the eye for design, Richard continued, squeezing her waist. She's transformed this old place completely. You should see what she did. With the master suite. The invitation to view their bedroom hung in the air, deliberately provocative. Several nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. "Perhaps another time," I said, forcing a smile. Vanessa tilted her head, her perfectly styled hair falling just so across one shoulder. "Richard tells me you're still in that little condo downtown? The one you two had before everything?" "Before you destroyed my marriage, I thought but didn't say." "It suits me," I replied instead. "I've always preferred quality over quantity." Richard's smile tightened fractionally. "Well, we wanted something with room to grow. The future and all that." The implication stung more than it should have. At 43, children had been something we'd tried for and failed to have. It had been a source of silent grief throughout our marriage, one Richard had apparently decided to weaponize now. "How thoughtful of you to invite me to see this new chapter of yours," I said, struggling to maintain my composure. "We thought it was important," Vanessa interjected, her smile sharp as a knife. "Closure is so essential for moving forward, don't you think? And we wanted you to see that Richard has finally found the happiness he deserves." A small crowd had gathered around us now, drawn by the spectacle of the ex-wife confrontation. I recognized several faces from our old social circle. People who had quietly taken Richard's side in the divorce, convinced by whatever narrative he'd spun about our marriage's collapse. "Happiness looks good on you both," I said, raising my glass slightly in a mock toast. "And the house is certainly impressive." Richard puffed up visibly. "We got it for a steal, actually. The previous owners were desperate to sell after that whole foreclosure mess. Their misfortune? Our good luck. Fortune favors the bold," Vanessa added, surveying the room with undisguised pride. "When Richard showed me this place, I knew instantly it was meant to be ours. Some things are just destined, wouldn't you agree?" The barely veiled reference to their relationship made my stomach turn. I took another sip of champagne, wishing I'd never accepted this toxic invitation. "Richard was always good at recognizing opportunities," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. He laughed, a sound I once loved but now made my skin crawl. "Speaking of opportunities, have you met our neighbor? Eleanor Blackwood from Blackwood. Real estate? She's the one who tipped us off about this place before it even hit the market." A tall woman in a tailored suit approached, hand extended. "Pleasure to meet you, Julia. Richard speaks very highly of you." Her tone suggested the exact opposite. "Does he?" I replied, shaking her hand briefly. "How uncharacteristic." Eleanor glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension. "This property has quite a history. The Harrington estate was one of the most coveted addresses in the valley for decades. And now it's ours," Vanessa said, running her hand possessively along a nearby marble countertop. "We've already started planning the renovations for the East Wing. Richard's home office will have the most spectacular view of the mountains." "It must be quite the adjustment," Eleanor said to me, her sympathy so false it practically dripped with condescension. "Going from all this to, well, urban living has its own charms, I suppose." The pity in her eyes was unbearable. I'd been holding my emotions in check, but something inside me snapped. I'd come here thinking I could handle whatever game Richard was playing, that I was strong enough to face their happiness with dignity. But this orchestrated humiliation, parading me through their perfect new life while everyone watched, was too much. I placed my still full champagne glass on a nearby table. "It's getting late. I should be going." "So soon?" Richard feigned disappointment. "But you haven't even seen the gardens. The landscaper just finished the koi pond last week." "Another time, perhaps," I said, already turning to leave. "Before you—" "Go!" Vanessa called after me, her voice carrying across the now hushed room. "Richard and I were hoping to get your blessing on something." She held out her left hand, where a massive diamond caught the light. "We're making it official next spring, right here, in the garden. We'd love for you to attend." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting for my reaction to this final, calculated blow. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching somewhere between my lungs and my throat. But before I could respond, my phone chimed with a text message. I glanced down at the screen, and despite everything, a small smile formed on my lips. "Congratulations," I said, looking back up at them with newfound calm. "I hope your future here brings you everything you deserve." There must have been something in my tone, because Richard's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just a sincere wish for your happiness," I replied, my smile growing more genuine by the second. After all, life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it? As I turned to leave, I felt lighter than I had in months. Outside, a sleek black car was pulling up to the curb, right on time. Tomorrow would bring revelations that neither Richard nor his bride-to-be were prepared for, and for the first time since our marriage ended, I found myself looking forward to the future with something that felt remarkably like joy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The black car glided to a stop as I stepped outside the mansion, its tinted windows reflecting the warm glow of lights from the party I'd just escaped. Fallen maple leaves crunched beneath my heels, their russet and gold colors like nature's own protest against the coming winter. In the distance, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, their familiar silhouette a constant in a life that had become anything but. "Rough night?" Michael asked as he opened the passenger door for me. His voice carried the gentle understanding that had become my lifeline these past 6 months. I slipped into the leather seat and exhaled, slowly, feeling the tension begin to drain from my shoulders. "You have no idea." As we pulled away from the curb, I watched the Victorian mansion recede in the side mirror. All stately columns and intricate woodwork, windows blazing with light, so beautiful and yet now tainted by Richard and Vanessa's presence. The house I'd once dreamed of owning, now the showcase for my replacement's perfect life. "Did he invite you just to rub it in?" Michael asked, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel despite the edge in his voice. "That, and to announce their engagement?" I replied, turning away from the mirror to face forward. "Apparently they're getting married in the garden this spring." Michael's soft whistle carried both sympathy and disbelief. "That's cold, even, for Richard." He always did know exactly where to twist the knife. We drove in comfortable silence through the winding roads of Oakwood Heights, the exclusive neighborhood that had once intimidated me with its old money and quiet elegance. Now, having spent 15 years as Mrs. Richard Harrington, the daughter-in-law of Judge William Harrington, whose family had helped found this town, I knew the truth behind many of these pristine facades. The affairs carefully hidden, fortunes quietly dwindling, appearances desperately maintained. Oakwood Heights was a beautiful veneer over complicated lives, not unlike my marriage had been. "Your timing was perfect," I said finally, glancing at Michael. "One more minute in there, and I might have caused a scene." He smiled, the corner of his eyes crinkling in that way that always reminded me of better times. "Can't have that." "Julia, Coleman doesn't do scenes. She executes plans." The use of my maiden name, Coleman instead of Harrington, felt both strange and right. 6 months after the divorce, I was still adjusting to reclaiming pieces of my former self. "Speaking of plans," Michael continued, "everything's set for tomorrow. Marjorie reviewed all the documentation and says it's airtight. Richard won't know." "What hit him?" The headlights illuminated the road ahead as we left the residential area behind, cutting through the nature preserve that separated Oakwood Heights from the rest of Westlake. This stretch of road had always been my favorite, a momentary escape into darkness and wilderness before the glow of downtown appeared on the horizon. "Do you think I'm being vindictive?" I asked, voicing the doubt that had been needling me for weeks. Part of me wonders if I should just let them have the house and move on with my life. Michael considered this before answering, his profile thoughtful in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "After what I saw tonight? No, I don't think you're being vindictive. I think you're finally standing up for yourself." I turned to stare out the window, watching the tall pines blur past. Tomorrow would change everything, and despite my resolve, a heavy weight of memories pressed against my chest. "It wasn't always bad, you know," I said softly. "Our marriage. There were good years before everything changed." Michael nodded, understanding in his silence. As Richard's former business partner and my oldest friend, he'd witnessed both the rise and fall of our relationship firsthand. "The problem with long marriages that end badly," he replied after a moment, "is that the pain of the ending can poison the memory of everything that came before." The truth of his words settled over me as the trees thinned and the first buildings of downtown came into view. Westlake at night was a modest but lovely sight. Historic brick buildings from the early 1900s juxtaposed with sleek, modern additions, all reflected in the calm waters of the actual lake that gave the town its name. "Do you remember?" I said as we approached the water. That summer when Richard and I first moved back here from Chicago. We were so young, living in that tiny apartment above Martin's bookstore. Michael smiled. I remember. You used to have dinner parties on that ridiculously small balcony. 5 people crammed around a card table, drinking cheap wine and planning how we were going to change the world. Those were good days, I murmured, before Richard joined his father's firm. Before the Harrington legacy became more important than anything else. We pulled up to my building, the Lakeside, an elegant pre-war apartment complex that had been converted into luxury condos a decade ago. Richard had bought our unit as an investment property, insisting that downtown was up and coming. When we divorced, he'd been so eager to liquidate assets before the settlement that he'd practically given me the condo just to finalize things quickly. Little had he known that it would triple in value within 4 years as Westlake underwent a renaissance, becoming one of the most desirable small cities in the state. What time tomorrow? I asked as Michael pulled under the porte cochere. 10 sharp. I'll pick you up at 9:30. I nodded, gathering my purse and the remnants of my dignity. Thank you for coming to get me tonight. I don't know what I would have done if I'd had to call a rideshare from that party. That's what friends are for, he replied, his gaze holding mine for a beat longer than necessary. Besides, someone needs to be there to witness the look on Richard's face tomorrow when he realizes what's happening. The doorman opened my car, door with a polite nod. Good evening, Ms. Coleman. Evening, Frank, I replied, stepping out into the cool night air. Back in my apartment, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of Cabernet, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the lake. Despite its modest size compared to the mansion I'd left behind, this space felt more like home than any place I'd lived in years. Here, surrounded by artwork I'd selected, furniture chosen for comfort rather than impression, books I actually read rather than displayed, I had rediscovered parts of myself that had slowly disappeared during my marriage. The quiet curator who preferred museums to charity galas, the amateur photographer who loved capturing ordinary moments, the woman who could spend an entire Sunday lost in a novel without feeling guilty about wasting time. I sipped my wine and watched the moonlight ripple across the dark water, thinking about the path that had led me here. 15 years with Richard, slowly molding myself to fit the expectations of being a Harrington, gradually giving up pieces of my identity until one day I'd looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Then 6 months ago, the text message that had shattered everything. I need to be honest with us both. I've met someone. I'm not coming home. 15 years, ended in 14 words. I'd later learn he'd been seeing Vanessa for over a year, that colleagues had known, that some of our friends had suspected, that I was, apparently, the last to know. But tomorrow, Richard would discover that I'd learned a few things during our marriage, that I'd been paying attention during all those dinner conversations with his father about property law, that I'd been more than just an ornamental wife at those firm meetings. Tomorrow, he would learn that sometimes the past catches up in ways you least expect. I raised my glass to my reflection in the window. To closure, I whispered, and took another sip of wine. The text I'd received at the party glowed on my phone screen, still open on the coffee table. Documents delivered to clerk. Filing confirmed for 9 a.m., everything ready for tomorrow. And beneath it, my attorney's final words. After. Tomorrow, the house will officially be back in your name. Legally, they'll have 30 days to vacate. Life has a way of teaching us its most important lessons through our deepest wounds. Sometimes we find our true strength only after everything we thought was solid crumbles beneath our feet. And sometimes, justice arrives not as a thunderous declaration, but as a quiet document signed in an office on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke before my alarm, the pale autumn sunlight filtering through my curtains. For the first time in months, I felt rested, clear-headed, purposeful. Today wasn't about revenge, though I couldn't deny the satisfaction I anticipated. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, Not just a house, but my sense of self-worth. As I showered and dressed with particular care, choosing a tailored charcoal pantsuit that Richard had always complained made me look too severe, I thought about all the women who had found themselves in similar positions. Discarded after years of sacrifice and support, replaced by younger versions as if we were appliances that had outlived our warranty period, made to feel as though our best years were behind us while our husbands embarked on second acts with fresh-faced partners. Society had a script for women like me: graceful retreat into bitterness or desperate attempts to compete with our replacements. Few expected us to rise, to reclaim, to rebuild something better than what we had lost. I applied my makeup with precision, something I'd stopped doing in the final years of my marriage when Richard seemed to stop seeing me altogether. My reflection looked back at me with clear eyes and a determined set to my jaw. I hardly recognized this woman, and yet she felt more authentic than the person I'd been for years. The doorbell rang precisely at 9:30. Michael stood in the hallway holding 2 to-go cups from Westlake Coffee Roasters, the local cafe, where we'd taken to meeting weekly since the divorce. "You look like a woman about to close a deal," he said, handing me a cup. "Isn't that exactly what I'm doing?" I replied, accepting the coffee with a smile. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I watched the town roll by outside my window, the bakery where Richard and I used to buy Sunday morning pastries, the park where we'd once discussed having children someday, the movie theater where we'd had our first date back when we were just college students home for summer break. So many memories embedded in these streets, both sweet and painful. "You know," Michael said as we stopped at a red light, "what you're doing today, it isn't just about the house." I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "It's about making right something that's been wrong for a long time." He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice carried a quiet intensity. "Richard has always taken what didn't belong to him and acted like it was his birthright. The house is just the most recent example." The light turned green, and we continued toward the courthouse. Michael's words settled over me, resonating with a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged. For years, Richard had taken credit for my ideas at dinner parties, spoken over me in conversations, made decisions that affected us both without consulting me. The pattern had been there all along, but I'd been too in love, too committed to our marriage to recognize it. "When did you know?" I asked. "That Richard wasn't the person I thought he was?" Michael was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. "Do you remember the Thompson project? About 7 years ago?" I nodded. The Thompson development had been a significant commercial property deal, one that had cemented Richard's reputation as a rising star in his father's firm. "That was originally your proposal," Michael continued. "You mentioned it over dinner one night, converting that old warehouse district into mixed-use spaces with affordable housing units above local businesses. You had it all mapped out, talking about community impact and sustainable growth. And 3 weeks later, Richard presented it to the firm as his own idea," I finished, the memory suddenly crystal clear. "When I mentioned it, he said he'd given me full credit in the meeting." "He hadn't," Michael said simply. "In fact, he made a point of telling everyone he'd come up with it despite your objections." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it still stung. How many other times had he taken from me while convincing me I'd been given credit? How many of his accomplishments had actually been built on ideas he'd appropriated? "The house is different, though," I said after a moment. "This time I have documentation, proof." We pulled into the courthouse parking lot, a stately building of red brick and white columns that housed both county offices and courtrooms. My attorney, Marjorie Chen, was waiting on the steps, a slim leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Ready?" she asked as we approached. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's do this." Inside, the process was remarkably anticlimactic for something that would change so many lives. A clerk verified my identification, reviewed the documentation one final time, and applied the necessary stamps and signatures. In less than 30 minutes, ownership of the Victorian mansion at 1482 Oakwood Heights Drive was officially transferred back into my name. "Congratulations," Marjorie said, handing me a copy of the filed deed. "The property is now legally yours, again. The notification will be delivered to the current occupants today, and they'll have 30 days to vacate unless other arrangements are made." I stared down at the document, tracing my fingertip over my name printed in official text. After all the pain and humiliation, after months of meticulous preparation and patience, justice had arrived in the form of a simple legal document. "What happens now?" Michael asked as we walked back to the car. "Now," I said, tucking the papers carefully into my bag, "we deliver the news in person." The drive to Oakwood Heights was fraught with a tension that hadn't been there before. What had been abstract was now concrete. The house was mine, and soon Richard and Vanessa would know it. I found myself wondering how they would react, what expressions would cross their faces when they realized what had happened. "Are you nervous?" Michael asked as we turned onto the tree-lined street where the mansion stood. "Oddly, no," I replied, realizing it was true. "I feel resolved, like something that's been out of alignment for years is finally clicking back into place." As we approached the house, my house, I thought about all the women watching stories like mine unfold on social media, in online forums, in quiet conversations over coffee. Women whose husbands had disappeared into midlife crises and emerged, with younger partners, leaving decades of shared life in ruins. Women who had been told to accept their losses gracefully, to not make waves, to move on without making a fuss. This moment wasn't just for me. It was for all of us who had been discarded and deceived, who had rebuilt ourselves from the broken pieces left behind. It was proof that sometimes justice arrives late but arrives nonetheless. That sometimes the story doesn't end with the heartbreak but continues into something unexpected and empowering. "We're here," Michael said, pulling up to the curb in front of the mansion. I looked up at the house that Richard had once deemed too much work, but had eagerly claimed after our divorce. The house that would soon be returned to me, along with a measure of justice I hadn't dared hope for 6 months ago. "Let's go deliver the news," I said, stepping out of the car with the quiet confidence of a woman who was, at long last, reclaiming what was hers. The path to the front door seemed both longer and shorter than I remembered. Autumn had transformed the landscaping since my last visit, painting the Japanese maples in brilliant crimson and scattering golden leaves across the herringbone brick walkway. A walkway I had designed during one of the many hours I'd spent imagining living in this house, back when it was just a dream Richard had dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 15 years, I had been the practical one in our marriage, the planner, the one who researched investments, who saved for our future, who thought about the long game while Richard focused on immediate gratification. I had been the one to suggest setting aside money each month in a separate account. For something special someday, I'd told him. Richard had nodded absently, trusting me to handle the finances as he always did, too busy climbing the ladder at his father's firm to concern himself with such details. He never asked how much we were saving or where exactly the money was going. His trust had been both a gift and his undoing. Because that separate account, the one that had grown steadily, over the years, was in my name only. And when the opportunity came to quietly purchase this house through a private LLC during the foreclosure 5 years ago, I had seized it, intending it as a surprise for our 20th anniversary. A surprise that would never come. "You okay?" Michael asked, his steady presence beside me a reminder that I wasn't facing this moment alone. "I'm fine," I replied, surprised to find it was true. The anxiety I had expected to feel was nowhere to be found. Just remembering. We reached the grand oak door with its original stained glass insets, another feature I had fallen in love with years ago. I pressed the doorbell, and heard the same melodic chime echo through the foyer inside. The sound transported me back to the first time I'd toured this house, envisioning holiday gatherings and quiet Sunday mornings in its gracious rooms. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal a young woman in a maid's uniform, something that made me blink in surprise. Richard and I had never employed household staff during our marriage, despite his family's suggestions that it was expected for someone of his position. "May I help you?" she asked politely, though her expression suggested she recognized me from the party the night before. "I'm here to see Richard," I said. "Is he available?" She hesitated, clearly uncertain about the protocol for admitting the ex-wife. "One moment, please." As she disappeared into the house, I caught Michael's eye. "A maid," I mouthed silently. He raised an eyebrow. Apparently, Vanessa has different standards. Before I could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from irritation to surprise to wariness in quick succession. He was wearing casual attire, designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, his version of a relaxed weekend at home. "Julia," he said, making no move to invite us in. "Twice in 24 hours. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We have some business to discuss," I replied, keeping my tone professional. "May we come in?" His gaze flicked to Michael, narrowing slightly. The two had once been close friends and business partners before Michael had left the firm following my divorce from Richard, a departure that had deepened the rift between them. "What kind of business?" Richard asked, suspicion evident in his voice. "The kind best discussed in private," Michael replied evenly. After a moment of obvious internal debate, Richard stepped back, gesturing us into the foyer with reluctance. "Vanessa is at yoga," he said, as if warning us not to get comfortable. "She'll be back soon." "Perfect," I said. "She should hear this too." The foyer opened into a grand living room where crystal vases now held expensive floral arrangements, and new artwork adorned the walls, all sleek, modern pieces that clashed with the home's Victorian character. I recognized Vanessa's influence immediately. These were exactly the kind of status symbol acquisitions she would favor. Richard led us into what had once been the library, but had apparently been converted into a home office. Heavy oak shelving still lined the walls, but now they displayed awards and photos of Richard with local celebrities and politicians rather than books. His massive desk dominated the space, positioned to take advantage of the view of the grounds, through the bay window. "What's this about?" he asked, not offering us seats but taking his place behind the desk like a king granting an audience. "The house," I said simply. He frowned. "What about it?" "Do you remember?" I began, moving to examine a framed photo on the shelf as if we were having a casual conversation. "When we first looked at this property 6 years ago, you said it was too expensive, too much maintenance. A money pit, I believe. Were your exact words." Richard's frown deepened. "Is that why you're here? To remind me that my taste has evolved?" "People change, Julia." "They certainly do," I agreed, turning to face him directly. "Some change from devoted husbands into men who leave their wives via text message after 15 years. His jaw tightened. "If you came here to rehash our divorce—" "I didn't," I interrupted, calmly. "I came to discuss the ownership of this house." Something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, quickly masked. "The ownership? What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, we heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of Vanessa's voice calling out to Richard. Moments later, she appeared in the doorway, still in her designer athleisure wear, a luxury yoga mat tucked under one arm. Her expression shifted from surprise to poorly concealed hostility when she saw us. "I didn't realize we had company," she said, her tone making it clear we were unwelcome. "They were just leaving," Richard replied, standing from his desk. "Actually," Michael said, "we have some important information to share with both of you." "Vanessa." moved to stand beside Richard, her hand possessively on his shoulder. The gesture was deliberate, a visual reminder of her place in his life now. What information? I reached into my bag and removed the folder containing the property documents, placing it on Richard's desk without opening it. Do you know who owns this house, Richard? He stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. What kind of question is that? I do, obviously. Actually, I said quietly, you don't. You never did. The momentary silence that followed was absolute. What are you talking about? Vanessa demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. We bought this house 4 months ago. No, I corrected gently. You're renting it from Westlake Heritage Properties, LLC, the same LLC that purchased it during the foreclosure 5 years ago. Richard's face had gone very still, a muscle working in his jaw as the implications began to dawn on him. What does this have to do with you? He asked, though I could tell by his expression that he was beginning to piece it together. Westlake. Heritage Properties is my company, I said. I established it specifically to purchase this house. Vanessa looked between us, confusion evident. That's impossible. The real estate agent said, Eleanor Blackwood? I interrupted. She's a friend of mine. She helped me structure the purchase through the LLC to keep it anonymous. Richard's face had drained of color. You're lying, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. In response, I opened the folder on his desk, revealing the original deed, the LLC formation documents with my name clearly listed as the sole owner, and the most damning evidence of all, the rental agreement he had signed 4 months ago, leasing the property from my company. You never actually read the paperwork, did you? I asked softly. You just signed where Eleanor told you to sign, assuming you were purchasing the property. He stared at the documents, then at me, comprehension and fury dawning in his eyes. You set me up. No, Richard, I corrected him. I purchased a house I loved 5 years ago, using money I had saved over the course of our marriage, money you never bothered to ask about. When Eleanor told me a couple wanted to rent it, I agreed. I had no idea it was you until the papers were already signed. Vanessa snatched up the rental agreement, her eyes scanning the text frantically. This can't be legal, she said, her voice rising. We made a down payment. You made the first and last month's rent, plus a security deposit, Michael clarified, standard for a luxury rental property. If you read the agreement, it's all quite clear. Richard slammed his fist on the desk, making us all jump. This is about revenge. You're doing this to punish me. I met his gaze calmly. No, Richard. This is about ownership. The house is mine. It always has been. This is ridiculous, Vanessa said, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. You can't just show up and claim our house is yours. We have rights. You're right, I replied calmly, is to occupy the property until the lease termination, which I've initiated today. The notification has been officially filed. You have 30 days to vacate. Richard's face had transformed, the shock giving way to the cold, calculating expression I'd seen countless times during our marriage when he felt cornered. It was the same look he wore in the courtroom when preparing to undermine an opposing argument, assessing weaknesses, planning his counterattack. You won't get away with this, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet I knew so well. You think you've been clever, but you've just started a war you can't win. Michael stepped forward slightly. Everything has been done legally. Richard, the property was purchased legitimately, the rental agreement is binding, and the termination follows all state laws. You're welcome to challenge it, but you'll lose. Richard's attention shifted to Michael, his eyes narrowing. So this is why you left the firm. You were helping her plan this all along. I left the firm because I didn't like what you were becoming, Michael replied evenly. Julia approached me about this only after the divorce was finalized. Vanessa had begun pacing, her perfect yoga outfit and sleek ponytail at odds with her rapidly deteriorating composure. This is insane. We've already started renovations. We've invited people to our wedding here. I'm aware, I said. I was at your housewarming party last night, remember? When you made a point of showing off how perfectly your life was going without me. Richard's expression darkened further. Is that what this is about? You're bitter about the divorce, so you concocted this scheme to humiliate us? No, Richard. This is about ownership and consequences. The house was mine before you ever moved in. I purchased it 5 years ago as an investment, intending it as a surprise for our 20th anniversary. I allowed myself a small, sad smile. Obviously, that didn't work out as planned. This revelation seemed to stun him momentarily. For a brief instant, something like regret flickered across his features before being quickly suppressed. You expect me to believe that? That this was going to be some grand romantic gesture? Believe what you want, I replied. The legal reality remains the same. The house is mine, and I've terminated your lease. Vanessa stopped pacing to stare at me, her perfect features contorted with fury. You vindictive bitch. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching us squirm. Careful, Vanessa, Michael warned quietly. This conversation is already tense enough. She whirled on him. Oh, I see how it is now. You two are together, aren't you? Planning this ambush, laughing behind our backs. Michael is my friend, I said firmly. One of the few who stood by me when Richard decided our 15-year marriage wasn't worth fighting for. Richard pushed away from his desk, coming to stand directly in front of me. Though he didn't touch me, his physical presence was deliberately intimidating, a tactic he'd used subtly throughout our marriage when arguments weren't going his way. Let me make something very clear, he said, his voice low and controlled. I will fight this. I will tie you up in litigation for years. By the time I'm done, whatever satisfaction you think you're getting today will have cost you everything. I didn't step back, though every instinct urged me to create distance. Instead, I held my ground, meeting his gaze steadily. You're welcome to try, but unlike during our marriage, I'm not intimidated by your legal threats anymore. You should be, he responded. You have no idea what I'm capable of when someone crosses me. Actually, I do, I countered. I watched you destroy people in court for 15 years. I saw how you celebrated ruining lives over dinner, treating other people's misfortunes as professional victories. That's why I planned this so carefully. Because I know exactly what you're capable of. Vanessa had moved to Richard's side, her hand on his arm as if physically restraining him. There must be some arrangement we can come to, she said, her tone abruptly shifting to something more conciliatory. A fair market purchase, perhaps. We're prepared to be generous. The sudden pivot to negotiation didn't surprise me. It was exactly what Richard had taught her. When intimidation fails, switch to bargaining. The property isn't for sale, I replied. Not to you. Everyone has a price, she insisted, the desperation seeping through her polished veneer. Name yours. I considered her for a moment. This woman who had knowingly entered into an affair with my husband, who had moved into what she thought was his house, who had invited me to witness their happiness with the explicit intention of making me feel inferior. There isn't enough money in the world, Vanessa. Richard's jaw clenched. This is because of her, isn't it? You don't care about the house. You just want to punish me for choosing her. The accusation was so wildly off base that I actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound that seemed to startle them both. Richard, this may come as a shock to your ego, but this isn't about you or your girlfriend. This is about a house I fell in love with and purchased with my own money 5 years ago. I gestured around the room. A house, I might add, that you initially wanted nothing to do with until it suited your new image. You've changed, he said, as if this were an accusation rather than an observation. The Julia I knew wouldn't do something like this. You're right, I agreed. The Julia you knew, the one who accommodated your every demand, who made herself smaller to fit into your world, who continuously forgave your selfish behavior. She wouldn't have done this. But that Julia doesn't exist anymore. You destroyed her when you threw away 15 years like it meant nothing. Something in my words seemed to land harder than I'd intended. For a brief moment, Richard looked genuinely shaken, as if seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time since our divorce. Vanessa, however, had recovered her composure and shifted to attack mode. So what happens now? You throw us out on the street? Congratulations on your petty victory. You have 30 days, as specified in the lease termination, I replied evenly. That's standard procedure, and more than generous considering the circumstances. And then what? Richard demanded. You move in here by yourself? Turn it into some shrine to our failed marriage? I smiled slightly. What I do with my property is no longer any of your concern. Richard stared at me, his expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. In that moment, I realized how completely the man I had loved had vanished, replaced by someone calculating and cruel. This isn't over, he said quietly. Not by a long shot. Actually, it is, Michael interjected, stepping forward. The legal documentation is ironclad. You signed a rental agreement, not a purchase contract. The tension in the room was palpable, a physical force pressing against my skin. Richard's eyes had taken on that dangerous glint I recognized from his most contentious court cases, the look that meant he was preparing to destroy an opponent regardless of the cost. You have no idea what you've started, he said, his voice deceptively calm. I made you, Julia. Everything you are, everything you have, it all came from me and my family. The statement hung in the air between us, so fundamentally wrong yet, so perfectly encapsulating the way he had always viewed our relationship. In his mind, I had been an extension of himself, a beneficiary of his generosity rather than an equal partner. That's not true, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the surge of anger his words provoked. I brought my own education, my own inheritance, my own career to our marriage. I gave up my position at the museum to support your advancement. I managed our home, our social calendar, your parents' care when they were ill. I was your partner, not your creation. He dismissed this with a wave of his hand. Revisionist history. You were a junior curator at a third-rate museum when we met. My father gave you connections. My name gave you status. Michael shifted beside me, clearly uncomfortable, with the direction the conversation had taken. This isn't productive, Richard. Stay out of this, Richard snapped. This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, I corrected quietly. Not even that for much longer if you continue with this absurd charade, he threatened, leaning forward. I'll have my legal team review our divorce settlement. We'll claim fraud, concealment of assets. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if you have enough left for a studio apartment. The threat should have terrified me. A year ago, it would have. Richard was not just a skilled attorney. He was the son of a prominent judge, a man with deep connections throughout the legal system in our state. His firm represented half the power players in the region. On paper, the balance of power was entirely in his favor. But paper didn't tell the whole story. You're forgetting something important, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I kept meticulous records during our entire marriage, including documentation of the separate property funds I used to purchase this house, money that was explicitly excluded from our community property in the prenuptial agreement your father insisted I sign. Richard's expression faltered slightly. The prenup had been his family's idea, designed to protect the Harrington assets from me should our marriage fail. In their desire to shield their son from a potential gold digger, they had inadvertently created the very legal structure that now protected my ownership of the house. That prenup was never meant to protect me from you? I finished for him. No, it wasn't. But legal documents don't care about intentions, Richard. You taught me that. Vanessa, who had been watching our exchange with increasing alarm, stepped forward. "There must be something we can do," she said, her tone shifting to one of calculated reason. "Some arrangement that would be mutually beneficial." "I'm listening," I replied, though I had no intention of negotiating. She glanced at Richard before continuing. "Richard has connections that could be valuable to you. Perhaps we could discuss a more favorable time frame for vacating the property in exchange for certain considerations." "What kind of considerations?" I asked, curious to see how far they would go. "Professional recommendations, social introductions, perhaps even a position at the firm," she offered, as if these were generous concessions rather than the very things Richard had systematically stripped from me during our divorce. I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me. "You think I want Richard's approval? His connections? After he spent the last 6 months telling everyone who would listen that I was emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible?" Richard at least had the decency to look uncomfortable at this direct reference to the narrative he'd crafted about our divorce. "That was unfortunate," he conceded, offering no actual apology. "Heat of the moment, during a difficult transition." "A transition you created by having an affair with your colleague," I pointed out. "A colleague who is now offering me table scraps of social acceptance in exchange for the house that legally belongs to me." Vanessa flushed with anger. I was trying to be reasonable, but clearly, reasonableness isn't your strong suit. "On the contrary," Michael interjected, "Julia has been extremely reasonable throughout this process. She could have exposed the rental arrangement at your housewarming party last night, in front of all your guests. Instead, she's addressing this privately and giving you the legally required notice period." Richard's eyes narrowed as he focused on Michael. "You've been behind this from the beginning, haven't you? Turned her against me, filled her head with ideas about getting even." The accusation was so typical of Richard, unable to believe I could make decisions independently, unwilling to accept that I might have agency separate from male influence. "Michael has been a friend," I said firmly. "Something you apparently never were, even during our marriage." Richard's face darkened. 15 years together, and this is how you repay my loyalty? By humiliating me? By threatening the home I'm creating with Vanessa?" The sheer audacity of his claim to loyalty momentarily stunned me into silence. It was Michael who responded, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "Loyalty? You left your wife of 15 years via text message. Richard, you were sleeping with another woman for a year before you bothered to end your marriage. You leveraged your connections to isolate Julia socially and professionally after the divorce. And now you have the nerve to talk about loyalty?" Richard's jaw tightened, a muscle working visibly at his temple. "You don't know anything about my marriage." "I know everything about it," Michael countered. "I was there for all of it. The holidays, the anniversaries, the dinner parties. I watched you gradually erode Julia's confidence, take credit for her ideas, dismiss her concerns. I saw how you treated her when you thought no one was looking." The room fell silent. Even Vanessa seemed taken aback by the rawness in Michael's voice, the accumulated frustration of years spent witnessing what he'd been powerless to stop. "Why do you even care?" Richard finally asked, his tone suspicious. "What's your stake in this?" Michael shook his head, a gesture of disbelief rather than denial. "Because unlike you, some people actually value friendship. Some people recognize worth that isn't tied to professional advancement or social standing." The implication hung heavy in the air, that Richard had never truly seen me, had never valued me for myself, rather than what I contributed to his image and comfort. Vanessa, perhaps sensing that the conversation was spiraling beyond her control, attempted to redirect. "This isn't getting us anywhere. The fact remains that we've made this house our home. We've invested in renovations, planned our future here." "Renovations you had no right to make," I pointed out. on a property you were renting, not owning. We were misled, she insisted, her voice rising. No, I corrected gently. You didn't read the paperwork. There's a difference. Richard's expression had shifted from anger to something more calculating. I recognized this look too, the moment when he pivoted strategies after realizing his initial approach had failed. Julia, he said, his voice suddenly softer, almost intimate. I know things ended badly between us. I handled it poorly, and for that I apologize. But this, he gestured around us, this isn't you. You're not vindictive. You're not cruel. The attempt at manipulation was so transparent that I almost pitied him. This isn't about vindictiveness, Richard. It's about reclaiming what's mine, a house I purchased years ago with my own money, because I loved it. The fact that you happen to be living in it now is an ironic coincidence. Nothing more. Nobody will believe that, Vanessa interjected. Everyone will see this for exactly what it is, a bitter ex-wife's revenge plot. I turned to her, suddenly weary of the circular conversation. What everyone thinks stopped mattering to me the day I received a text message ending my 15-year marriage. I've spent the last 6 months rebuilding my life while you've been redecorating my house. Your opinions, your judgments, your social circle, none of it matters to me anymore. The stark truth of my words seemed to land with unexpected force. For perhaps the first time, Richard and Vanessa appeared to realize that the power dynamics they had taken for granted, his social standing, her youthful confidence, their united front against the discarded ex-wife, held no sway over me any longer. The fundamental imbalance they had counted on no longer existed. Vanessa recovered first, her posture straightening as she recalibrated her approach. You know what? Fine. Keep the house if it means that much to you. We'll find something better, bigger, newer, with none of these outdated features you seem so attached to. Her dismissive tone made it clear she was attempting to salvage some dignity from the situation, to pretend the house had never really mattered to them anyway. But the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. That's certainly your prerogative, I replied evenly. You have 30 days to locate your upgrade. Richard had gone very still, his lawyer's mind clearly processing options, calculating risks and potential counter-strategies. When he finally spoke, his voice had taken on the dangerous smoothness I recognized from his courtroom performances. Tell me something, Julia. How long have you been planning this? Did you purchase this house knowing someday you'd use it against me? Was our entire marriage just a long game to you? The accusation was so wildly disconnected from reality that I might have laughed if the pain behind it weren't so evident. Even now, Richard couldn't conceive of a world where my actions weren't somehow about him, where I might have made decisions for myself rather than in reaction to him. I bought this house 5 years ago because I loved it, I replied quietly. Because I saw the potential in it that you couldn't or wouldn't see. It was going to be a surprise for our 20th anniversary, a place where we could start a new chapter together. I paused, the old grief momentarily catching in my throat. Obviously, you had other plans for our future. Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even a flash of regret, before hardening again into suspicion. Convenient timing, though, isn't it? That you just happened to own the house we rented after our divorce? Not convenient, Richard. Ironic. When Eleanor told me a couple had signed a rental agreement for the property, I had no idea it was you and Vanessa. I only discovered that when the first rent check arrived with your signature on it. And you said nothing? Vanessa demanded incredulously. For 4 months, you collected our rent checks knowing we thought we were buying this place? I shook my head. You signed a clearly worded rental agreement. If you believed otherwise, that's not my responsibility. It was Eleanor's responsibility. To be clear, Vanessa shot back. Eleanor Blackwood is one of the most respected real estate agents in the county, Michael interjected. Her documentation is always meticulous. If you misunderstood the nature of the transaction, it wasn't because the terms were unclear. Richard's expression had darkened further at the mention of Eleanor's name. Eleanor Blackwood, he repeated, slowly. She's your friend, isn't she? The one who helped you purchase this house originally? I nodded, seeing no reason to deny it. She is. She also helped me establish the LLC that holds the property. So she deliberately steered us toward a house she knew you owned, he said, his tone hardening with each word. She misrepresented the transaction, knowing we believed we were purchasing the property. That's simply not true, I countered firmly. Eleanor never misrepresented anything. The documentation clearly stated you were entering into a lease agreement, not a purchase. If you didn't read the paperwork before signing it, that's hardly her fault. Richard's face flushed with anger. This was a setup from the beginning. You and your friends conspiring to humiliate me to— Not everything is about you, Richard, I interrupted, my composure finally cracking. I bought this house for us, as a surprise, as a gift, because I loved you and wanted to build a future with you. You're the one who threw that future away when you decided 15 years meant nothing compared to a fresh start with someone new. The raw emotion in my voice seemed to startle all of us. For months, I had kept my pain carefully contained, refusing to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing how deeply he had wounded me. But now, standing in the house that should have been our shared future, the mask slipped. Vanessa had the grace to look uncomfortable, her gaze dropping to the floor as if suddenly unable to meet my eyes. Richard, however, seemed almost energized by my display of emotion, as if finally spotting a weakness he could exploit. If this is really about our marriage, he said, his voice softening to that persuasive tone I knew so well, then perhaps we should discuss this privately. Just the two of us. There might be a way forward that honors what we once meant to each other. The manipulation was so transparent that I nearly laughed. There's nothing to discuss privately, Richard. The house is mine. You have 30 days to vacate. That's the beginning and end of our business together. He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. Come on, Julia. We had 15 years together. That has to count for something. It counted for exactly 14 words in a text message. I replied coldly. I need to be honest with us both. I've met someone. I'm not coming home. The direct quote seemed to catch him off guard. Maybe he'd forgotten the exact wording of the message that had destroyed our marriage, or perhaps he'd convinced himself the delivery had been more compassionate than it actually was. That was a mistake, he conceded. Though whether he meant the method of delivery or the content itself remained deliberately ambiguous. I should have handled it differently. Yes, you should have, I agreed. But you didn't. And now we're here. Vanessa had been watching this exchange with increasing agitation, her composure deteriorating with each passing moment. This is ridiculous, she finally snapped. You can't just march in here and expect us to pack up our lives in 30 days. We have the engagement party planned here next week. We've invited Richard's entire firm, his father's colleagues from the bench. That sounds like a scheduling problem you'll need to address, I interrupted calmly. Perhaps one of those country clubs you mentioned last night could accommodate you on short notice. Her eyes widened with indignation. You're actually enjoying this, aren't you? Watching us scramble, disrupting our lives. No, Vanessa, I replied. Honestly. I'm not enjoying any of this, but I am reclaiming what's rightfully mine, and I make no apologies for that. Richard's expression had shifted again, calculation replacing persuasion. You know my father still has significant influence in this county, he said, his voice deceptively casual. One call from him, and your little property transfer could face all sorts of bureaucratic delays, regulatory reviews. The threat hung in the air between us, the implicit message clear. The Harrington family had the power to make my life difficult in ways that went beyond this house. Michael stepped forward, his patience visibly exhausted. "Are you really threatening to abuse your father's judicial connections to interfere with a private property transaction? Because that would be highly unethical, possibly illegal, and certainly the kind of thing the State Bar Association might take an interest in." Richard's gaze snapped to Michael, genuine anger flashing in his eyes. "Stay out of this. This is between me and Julia." "No," Michael replied firmly. "It's not. Julia has legal representation. She has documentation. She has witnesses. This isn't the private domain where you can intimidate her into backing down anymore." Something in Richard seemed to snap at that moment. The careful facade of control crumbled, revealing the raw fury beneath. "You have no idea what you've started," he snarled, turning back to me. "I made you, Julia. I can break you just as easily." The naked hostility in his voice sent a chill through me, but I stood my ground. "You didn't make me, Richard. You married me. And then you unmade yourself when you chose to throw away everything we built together." "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get out of my house right now." "It's not your house," I reminded him gently. "That's rather the point of this entire conversation." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening with the effort of restraint. For a moment, the tension in the room crystallized into something frightening, a glimpse of a rage I had never seen from him before, not even during our worst arguments. Michael must have sensed it too, because he moved slightly closer to me, his presence steady and reassuring. "I think we've said everything that needs saying for now," he suggested calmly. "The legal documentation has been delivered. The 30-day clock has started. Any further communication can go through the attorneys." Vanessa looked between Richard and me, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "This can't be happening," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else in the room. "We can't lose the house. The wedding." "I'm afraid it is happening," I replied, gathering my purse and the folder containing copies of the documentation we had already provided. "And now we'll leave you to process this information privately." As Michael and I turned to go, Richard called after me, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "This isn't over, Julia. Not by a long shot." I paused at the doorway, looking back at the man I had once pledged to love for a lifetime, now a stranger consumed by fury and wounded pride. "Yes, Richard," I said quietly. "It is." The walk back through the house felt endless, each step echoing on the hardwood floors I had once imagined living my life upon. Michael stayed close beside me, his presence a silent bulwark against the emotional storm raging inside me. We passed through the grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and stained glass windows that cast jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor. In the living room, Vanessa had replaced the built-in bookshelves with modernist art that clashed with the home's Victorian character. The dining room chandelier, an antique crystal piece I had carefully researched, had been swapped for something sleek and contemporary. Each alteration felt like an erasure, not just of my vision for the house, but of the life I had planned to live here. A life that now would never exist. Outside, the crisp autumn air hit my face like a physical relief, the tension of the confrontation still clinging to my skin like something tangible. I drew a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. "You okay?" Michael asked quietly as we reached his car. I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving me hollow and strangely vulnerable despite my victory. Once inside the car, with the doors closed against the world, I finally allowed myself to exhale, fully. My hands were trembling, I realized distantly, as if my body was only now processing the stress of the encounter. "That was," Michael began, then shook his head. "I've known Richard for 20 years, and I've never seen him like that." "I have," I said softly. "Not often, but enough to recognize it. When he feels truly cornered, truly threatened, There's a moment when the mask slips completely. Michael pulled away from the curb, casting one last glance at the mansion receding in the rearview mirror. Do you think he'll cause problems? I know he will, I replied with certainty. Richard doesn't lose gracefully. He never has. We drove in silence for several minutes, the familiar streets of Oakwood Heights giving way to the main road leading back toward town. My mind replayed the confrontation on an endless loop. Richard's expression when he realized the truth. Vanessa's dawning horror, the moment when threats replaced denial. Did I do the right thing? I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. Michael glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. What do you mean? Confronting them like that, taking back the house, all of it. I stared. Out the window at the passing scenery, the autumn colors a blur of red and gold. Part of me wonders if I should have just let them have it, moved on completely. Do you regret it? He asked carefully. I considered the question, examining my feelings with the honesty I'd promised myself after the divorce. No, I said finally. I don't regret reclaiming what's mine, but I'm not sure I was prepared for how it would feel. How does it feel? Complicated, I admitted. There's satisfaction, yes, relief even, but also, I searched for the right words. Sadness, anger, a strange sense of loss, which makes no sense because I've already lost everything there was to lose between Richard and me. Michael nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's it, though. Today made the ending real in a way it wasn't before. As long as there was still some unfinished business between you, some connection, however contentious, it wasn't really over, I finished. For him. Something like that. He agreed. We fell back into silence as the car wound its way toward downtown. The lake came into view, sunlight shimmering across its surface, the boardwalk dotted with couples and families enjoying the beautiful fall day, people living normal lives, untouched by the drama that had consumed my morning. He said he made me, I said after a while, the words emerging quietly, that everything I am came from him and his family. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's bullshit, and you know it. Intellectually, yes, but emotionally. I sighed. When someone spends 15 years subtly undermining your confidence, your independence, it leaves marks, Michael. Invisible ones that you don't even notice until later, when you're trying to rebuild yourself. He was quiet for a moment. I watched it happen, he finally said. All those years, I saw how he chipped away at you, piece by piece. The way he'd dismiss your ideas, then present them as his own a week later. The jokes at your expense that weren't really jokes. The constant reminders of how much you owed to the Harrington name. The accuracy of his observations startled me. You noticed all that? Everyone who really knew you noticed, he replied. We just didn't know how to help without making things worse. You loved him. And pointing out how he treated you seemed like it would only hurt you more. I absorbed this in silence, thinking of all the friends who had drifted away during my marriage, the relationships that had gradually faded until only the Harrington circle remained. Had they all seen what I couldn't? Had my isolation been partly self-imposed, a defense against truths I wasn't ready to face? When did it start? I asked, more to myself than to Michael. When did I start becoming less so that Richard could be more? Maybe that was the problem, Michael suggested gently. You never became less, Julia. You just got better at hiding how much more you were. And I think deep down, Richard knew that. It threatened him. We arrived at my building, the familiar facade of the lakeside, a welcome sight after the emotional turbulence of the morning. Michael pulled into a visitor's space but made no move to turn off the engine, sensing perhaps that our conversation wasn't finished. Do you know what scares me the most? I said, staring up at the building that had become my sanctuary these past months. The thought that I might never fully trust my own judgment again. that some part of me will always wonder if I'm missing the signs, overlooking the red flags, because I did it for so long with Richard. Michael turned toward me, his expression somber. The fact that you're asking these questions, that you're examining your past and your patterns, that's exactly why you should trust yourself, Julia. The person who doesn't question their own judgment is the one who should worry. The simple wisdom in his words penetrated the tangle of emotions I'd been wrestling with. There was something profoundly reassuring about being seen and understood without judgment, especially after years of having my perceptions subtly invalidated. I keep thinking about what Richard said, I confessed, about using the house against him, as if I orchestrated this entire situation as some elaborate revenge plot. That's Richard projecting, Michael replied firmly. He assumes you think the way he does, strategically, vindictively. He can't conceive of a world where your actions aren't about him, because in his world, everything revolves around him. I nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his assessment. It's strange, but in some ways, I feel sorry for them. Michael raised an eyebrow. For Richard and Vanessa? Yes, I said, surprising myself with the realization. They're building their relationship on such a shaky foundation. His midlife crisis, her ambition, mutual deception. Whatever they have, it started with betrayal, and that leaves a mark. Even if they stay together, there will always be that. Knowledge between them? That's remarkably compassionate considering everything they've put you through. I shrugged slightly. Maybe. Or maybe it's just that I finally see Richard clearly. The man I confronted today, angry, threatening, willing to use his father's influence to intimidate me, that's who he's always been beneath the polished exterior. I just didn't want to see it before. Michael was quiet for a moment. And now? What do you want now, Julia? The question was simple, but profound. What did I want, now that I had reclaimed the house, now that I had stood my ground against Richard's attempts to intimidate me? What did I want for my future, beyond this moment of necessary confrontation? I began, then paused, considering my words carefully. I want to stop defining myself in relation to Richard, as his ex-wife, as the woman he left, as the victor or victim in our shared history. I want to remember who I was before him and discover who I might become now, on my own terms. Michael nodded, a small smile touching his lips. That sounds like a pretty good starting point. I returned his smile, feeling something shift inside me, a tension releasing, a weight lifting. The confrontation with Richard had been necessary, but it wasn't the end of my journey. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Thank you, I said, simply, for being there today, for seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself. Always, he replied, the single word carrying a depth of meaning neither of us was quite ready to explore. As I stepped out of the car into the crisp autumn air, I felt lighter somehow, as if I had set down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. The battle with Richard wasn't over. I had no illusions about that. But the internal battlefield, the struggle to reclaim my sense of self and worth, felt suddenly less overwhelming. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I was standing firmly on my own ground. And that, I realized, was victory enough for today. 3 days passed in relative calm, the eye of the hurricane, I suspected, rather than a true peace. I threw myself into work at the museum, where I had recently been reinstated as curator, grateful for the distraction of cataloging new acquisitions and planning the winter exhibition. On the 4th morning, the storm arrived. I was in my office, reviewing proposed installations when my assistant knocked and entered without waiting for a response, her expression unusually tense. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice low. "Vanessa Mitchell. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's insisting it's urgent." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I had expected Richard to make the next move, not Vanessa. How does she seem? Agitated, my assistant replied diplomatically, but contained. Should I tell her you're unavailable? I considered this for a moment, weighing the potential benefits of avoidance against the reality that this confrontation was inevitable. No, it's all right. Send her in. Moments later, Vanessa appeared in my doorway. She was immaculately dressed as always, but the polished perfection of her appearance couldn't hide the strain evident in her face. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested sleepless nights, and the tightness around her mouth spoke of sustained stress. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, closing the door behind her. The courtesy seemed forced, at odds with the tension radiating from her posture. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Please sit down." She did so, perching on the edge of the seat as if ready to flee at any moment. For several seconds, she simply studied me, her expression unreadable. "You've lost weight," she finally said, the observation oddly personal. "Since the divorce." I wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected opening. "It's been a challenging adjustment," I said carefully. Vanessa nodded, a quick, sharp movement. "Richard hasn't been sleeping since your visit. He's been on the phone with lawyers, with his father, with colleagues. I've never seen him like this." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied, genuinely meaning it despite everything. The image of Richard spiraling, losing the control he valued so highly, brought me no joy. "Are you?" Vanessa asked, her tone hardening slightly. "Sorry, I mean, because from where I'm sitting, this looks very much like a calculated move designed to cause maximum disruption to our lives." I straightened in my chair, meeting her gaze directly. "I understand why it might appear that way to you. But as I explained before, this house was purchased long before your relationship with Richard began. Its significance to me predates both of you." Her expression flickered with something, doubt perhaps, or reluctant recognition. "Richard says you're lying, that there's no way you could have afforded that house on your own." "Richard has always underestimated me," I replied simply. "Financially, professionally, personally. It's a pattern I've only recently recognized clearly." Vanessa shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with this assessment. "Look, I didn't come here to debate the past. I came to negotiate." I raised an eyebrow. "Negotiate?" "Yes." She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a slim folder, placing it on my desk with deliberate care. "This is a formal offer to purchase the property at 1482 Oakwood Heights Drive. Fair market value, plus 15%. I didn't reach for the folder. "The house isn't for sale, Vanessa. I believe I made that clear." "Everyone has a price," she insisted, echoing her words from our previous encounter. "And this offer is significantly above market rate. It would allow you to purchase any other property in the county, with substantial funds left over." "It's not about the money," I said quietly. "Then what is it about?" she demanded, frustration breaking through her composed facade. "Revenge? Punishment? Making Richard suffer for leaving you?" The accusations hung in the air between us, harsh but not entirely unexpected. It was easier for her to cast me as the vindictive ex-wife than to accept the more complicated truth. "It's about ownership," I said finally. "Not just of the house, but of my life. For 15 years, I bent and compromised and reshaped myself to fit into Richard's world. I gave up pieces of myself so gradually, I didn't even notice they were gone until after he left." I met her gaze directly. "That house is one of the few things that was truly mine. My choice, my vision, purchased with my money. So no, it's not for sale." Vanessa stared at me, her expression a complex mixture of frustration and something that might have been reluctant understanding. "You don't seem to grasp what's at stake here. This isn't just about a house. Richard's reputation, our future." "I understand exactly what's at stake," I interrupted gently. Richard's carefully constructed image is threatened by the revelation that he didn't read a legal document before signing it. His pride is wounded by the discovery that his ex-wife outsmarted him. His new fiancée is embarrassed to admit to their social circle that the grand home they've been showcasing isn't actually theirs. Color rose in her cheeks. You're oversimplifying. Perhaps, I conceded, but so are you when you reduce my decision to spite or revenge. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. Our engagement party is scheduled for this weekend. Richard's father has invited half the judicial circuit. People are flying in from across the country. We can't possibly relocate or postpone at this point. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of sympathy for her position. Whatever I thought of Vanessa personally, whatever role she had played in the dissolution of my marriage, she was now caught in a situation partially of Richard's making. I'm not unreasonable, I said after a pause. You can hold your engagement. Party at the house as planned. Relief flashed across her face. Thank you. But, I continued firmly, the 30-day timeline still stands, and I'll need a formal acknowledgement in writing that you and Richard understand the house is my property and that you will vacate by the specified date. Her relief quickly transformed back into tension. Richard won't agree to that. Signing such a document would be tantamount to admitting he made a mistake. Then I'm afraid we don't have anything further to discuss, I replied, my resolve hardening. The legal situation is clear, regardless of whether Richard formally acknowledges it. Vanessa didn't move, her gaze searching my face as if looking for some weakness, some opening for negotiation. He says you've changed, that the Julia he knew would never have done something like this. He's right, I acknowledged. The Julia he knew, or thought he knew, was carefully constructed to accommodate his expectations. She prioritized his comfort over her own needs, his career over her aspirations, his image over her authenticity. I leaned back in my chair. That Julia disappeared the moment he texted to say he wasn't coming home. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression, a flicker of discomfort, perhaps even recognition. He texted you? To end your marriage? I nodded, watching realization dawn in her eyes. Whatever narrative Richard had constructed about our divorce, it clearly hadn't included this detail. 15 years, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. And he ended it with a text. 14 words, I confirmed. I counted them often. Enough. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to her hands. When she looked up again, there was a new wariness in her eyes. What happens if we refuse to leave? If we contest the eviction? It was the question I had been expecting since the beginning, the inevitable resistance to the new reality I had created. Then we go to court, I replied calmly, where the documentation of my ownership is clear and incontrovertible, where the rental agreement Richard signed is equally clear, where, I should add, everything becomes a matter of public record, including the fact that a respected attorney failed to read or understand a standard lease agreement. The implications hung heavy between us. Richard's professional reputation, already potentially compromised by the private revelation of his mistake, would be publicly damaged by court proceedings. He'll fight, she said, though her tone suggested less certainty than her words. He doesn't back down. Ever. I know, I replied. I was married to him for 15 years. She studied me for a moment longer, then slowly collected the folder containing the purchase offer. I'll talk to Richard about the engagement party and the rest. That would be wise, I agreed. As she stood to leave, Vanessa paused, her expression shifting to something more personal, less guarded. Can I ask you something? Not about the house or Richard, but woman to woman? I nodded, curious despite myself. Does it get easier? She asked, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. Living with the knowledge that someone could just walk away, after years together, as if it meant nothing. The question caught me off guard, both in its vulnerability and its implication. Was she already seeing in Richard what had taken me 15 years to recognize? The capacity for sudden, complete emotional detachment. "It doesn't get easier," I answered honestly. "But you get stronger. You rebuild yourself piece by piece until one day you realize you're standing on your own foundation again." Something like recognition flickered in her eyes, quickly masked but unmistakable. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, then turned and walked out of my office without another word. I sat motionless after she left, trying to process the unexpected turn our conversation had taken. Behind Vanessa's polished exterior and practiced confidence, I had glimpsed something I recognized all too well: the first seeds of doubt, the earliest cracks in the foundation of certainty. For the first time, I wondered if Vanessa might be more of a casualty in Richard's story than I had initially believed. Not innocent, certainly. She had knowingly entered a relationship with a married man, but perhaps not the calculating homewrecker I had imagined in my darkest moments. My phone chimed with a message from Michael. "Lunch, I'm downtown and could use friendly company." The invitation brought a small smile to my face, a welcome interruption to the heaviness of the morning. I typed back a quick acceptance, grateful for the prospect of ordinary conversation after the emotional complexity of Vanessa's visit. As I gathered my things to meet Michael, I reflected on the unexpected strength I had found in this confrontation. 6 months ago, perhaps even 1 month ago, I might have wavered in the face of Vanessa's persistence. I might have accepted the generous offer, telling myself it was the practical choice, the path of least resistance. But today, I had stood firm. Not out of spite or vindictiveness, but from a place of genuine self-worth, of knowing what I deserved and refusing to settle for less. It was a small victory, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but it felt significant. A marker of how far I had come since the day Richard's text message had shattered my world. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was the one setting the terms of my life. And regardless of what challenges Richard might still throw my way, that knowledge alone felt like a foundation strong enough to build upon. The cafe where Michael and I met for lunch was a small, sun-filled space tucked between a bookstore and an art gallery downtown. It had become our regular spot over the past few months, neutral territory, away from the haunts Richard and I had frequented during our marriage. Michael was already waiting at our usual corner table, a coffee in front of him and a second cup, prepared exactly as I liked it, waiting for me. The small gesture of thoughtfulness, so different from Richard's grand but impersonal gestures, warmed me in ways I was only beginning to recognize. "Rough morning?" he asked as I slid into the chair across from him. "Unexpected," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Vanessa came to see me at the museum." His eyebrows rose. "Alone? Without Richard?" I nodded. "With a purchase offer for the house. 15% above market value." Michael whistled softly. "That's substantial. Are you considering it?" "No," I said firmly. Though I did tell her they could still hold their engagement party there this weekend. It seemed unnecessarily cruel to force them to cancel at this point. He studied me for a moment, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You continue to surprise me, Julia Coleman." "How so?" "Most people in your position would enjoy watching them scramble. But you're extending consideration they never showed you." I shrugged slightly. "It's not about them. It's about who I want to be in this situation." Our conversation shifted to lighter topics as we ordered lunch. Michael's work at the architectural firm he'd joined after leaving Richard's legal practice, my upcoming exhibition at the museum, a film we both wanted to see. Normal, everyday exchanges that had become a lifeline during the tumultuous months following my divorce. It was only as we were finishing our meals that Michael's expression grew more serious. "I hate to bring this up during lunch, but there's something you should know about Richard." The shift in his tone immediately put me on alert. What about him? Michael hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. A colleague at my firm mentioned that Richard has been making inquiries about your LLC, specifically whether there were any irregularities in how it was formed or how the property was transferred. A cold weight settled in my stomach. He's looking for legal vulnerabilities. It appears so, Michael confirmed. From what my colleague could gather, Richard hasn't found anything substantive. Your paperwork is solid, but he's not giving up easily. I nodded, processing this unwelcome but unsurprising information. I expected as much. Richard doesn't lose gracefully, and he certainly doesn't accept defeat without exhausting every possible countermove. There's something else, Michael continued, his voice dropping slightly. A rumor that Richard's father is considering retirement from the bench. This was unexpected. Judge William Harrington was an institution in our county, stern, respected, and seemingly permanent. Really? He's only in his early 70s. I thought he intended to serve until the mandatory retirement age. That was the plan, Michael agreed. But apparently there's been some discussion of him stepping down early, and... He paused, his expression troubled. The timing is interesting. The implication was clear. If Judge Harrington retired now, the governor would appoint a replacement to serve until the next election cycle, and Richard, with his family connections and prestigious legal career, would be a natural candidate for that appointment. You think Richard is positioning himself for his father's seat? I said, the pieces clicking into place. And a public legal battle over property ownership would complicate that narrative. Michael nodded. It's just speculation at this point, but it fits the pattern. Richard has always been methodical about career advancement, and a judgeship would be the next logical step. The information shifted my understanding of the situation subtly but significantly. If Richard was indeed angling for a judicial appointment, the stakes of our property dispute extended far beyond wounded pride or inconvenience. A public legal battle that revealed his carelessness with legal documents would be politically damaging, potentially derailing his ambitions. This explains Vanessa's urgency, I murmured, thinking aloud. The generous offer, her insistence on a quick resolution. It would certainly add pressure to resolve this quietly, Michael agreed. I sipped my coffee, considering the implications. So I now have leverage I didn't realize I possessed. Potentially, yes, Michael confirmed. Though using it would mean stepping into exactly the kind of calculated game Richard excels at playing. I smiled slightly. You think I should take the high road? I think, he replied carefully, that you should make decisions based on what brings you peace, not what inflicts the most strategic damage on Richard. One path leads to healing, the other keeps you tethered to him through continued conflict. His words resonated with the conclusions I had already been reaching on my own. That true freedom from Richard meant making choices independent of his reactions, his suffering, or his convenience. You're right, I acknowledged, though I admit there's a certain temptation in the idea of holding this over him. Michael smiled. Of course there is. You're human. But you're also better than that, which is something Richard never fully appreciated about you. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made me freeze momentarily. Judge William Harrington. In 15 years of marriage to his son, my father-in-law had called me directly perhaps a dozen times, always for specific purposes related to family obligations or social functions. Since the divorce, there had been no contact whatsoever. I should take this, I said to Michael, who nodded in understanding. I stepped outside the cafe into the crisp autumn air before answering. Hello, Judge Harrington? Julia. His voice was exactly as I remembered, precise, measured, carrying the weight of authority honed through decades on the bench. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, I replied, keeping my tone neutral despite the tension coiling inside me. "This is an unexpected call." "Yes, well." He cleared his throat slightly. "Unusual circumstances sometimes require direct communication. I wonder if we might meet to discuss the situation regarding the Oakwood Heights property." Despite anticipating some form of intervention, from Richard's powerful father, the directness of the approach still caught me off guard. "I'm not sure what there is to discuss, Judge. The legal status of the property is quite clear." "Indeed," he replied, his tone giving nothing away. "Nevertheless, I believe a face-to-face conversation would be beneficial. Perhaps this afternoon? Say 3 o'clock at my chambers?" The suggestion, phrased as a polite request but carrying an unmistakable expectation of compliance, was pure William Harrington. During my marriage to Richard, such invitations had been functionally commands, part of the unspoken rules of belonging to the Harrington family. But I was no longer a Harrington. "I'm afraid my schedule is quite full today," I replied, surprising myself with my own calm refusal. "However, I could meet you for coffee tomorrow morning at Westlake Coffee Roasters downtown. Perhaps 9:30? The silence that followed spoke volumes. Judge Harrington was unaccustomed to having his suggested arrangements countered, particularly by someone he likely still viewed as his son's abandoned wife. "Very well," he said finally, his tone cooler than before. "Tomorrow at 9:30. Westlake Coffee Roasters? I'll see you then," I replied, ending the call before he could reclaim control of the conversation. I stood motionless for a moment, processing what had just occurred. For the first time in my memory, I had directly contradicted William Harrington's wishes, not with anger or defiance, but with simple, firm boundary setting. When I returned to our table, Michael took one look at my expression and raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Judge Harrington wants to meet with me about the house," I explained, sliding back into my chair. "He suggested his chambers this afternoon. I countered with coffee tomorrow morning. On my territory, not his." Michael's eyes widened slightly. "And he agreed?" "He did," I confirmed, still somewhat surprised myself, though I doubt he was pleased about it. A slow smile spread across Michael's face. "Julia Coleman continues her streak of surprising me. There was a time when you would have rearranged your entire schedule to accommodate a Harrington summons." He was right, of course. For years, I had oriented my life around the expectations and conveniences of the Harrington family, their social calendar, their traditions, their implied hierarchy of importance. The simple act of suggesting an alternative meeting time and place represented a small but significant shift in how I viewed myself in relation to them. "Things change," I said simply. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "They certainly do. The question is, what do you think Judge Harrington wants from this meeting?" I considered this, trying to anticipate the approach Richard's father might take. Best case scenario? He's going to try to broker some kind of compromise that saves face for Richard. Worst case? He'll attempt to intimidate me into backing down completely. "And how do you plan to respond?" I met Michael's gaze, feeling a calm certainty settle over me. "The same way I've been responding all along. By standing my ground and remembering that I'm no longer the woman who accommodates the Harringtons at the expense of herself." The unexpected shift in dynamics, from being at the mercy of Richard's anger to holding leverage in his political ambitions, from complying with his father's expectations to setting my own terms, felt like stepping into a new version of myself. Not hardened or bitter, but clear-eyed and grounded in my own worth. Tomorrow's meeting with Judge Harrington would be a test of this emerging strength. But for the first time, I was approaching a confrontation with the Harrington family without fear or uncertainty, simply the quiet confidence of knowing exactly where I stood and why. Westlake Coffee Roasters was already buzzing with morning activity when I arrived 15 minutes early for my meeting with Judge Harrington. I deliberately chose a table near the back, Private enough for conversation, but public enough to prevent the kind of intimidation tactics that might have occurred in his chambers. I ordered my usual coffee and, after a moment's consideration, requested Judge Harrington's preferred drink as well. Black coffee with a single precise teaspoon of sugar, no more, no less. It was a small courtesy, but one that acknowledged our shared history without conceding any ground. At precisely 9:29, the door opened, and William Harrington entered the cafe. Even at 72, he cut an imposing figure, tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored gray suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding respect, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me. Several patrons recognized him, nodding deferentially as he passed. In a town the size of Westlake, the Harrington name carried weight that extended far beyond the courtroom. For 3 generations, they had been pillars of the community: judges, philanthropists, power brokers. "Julia," he said as he reached my table, his tone formal but not cold. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Judge Harrington," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "I took the liberty of ordering your coffee. Black with 1 sugar, if your preference hasn't changed." A flicker of surprise crossed his features before he masked it with a polite nod. "It hasn't. Thank you." He settled into the chair with the deliberate movements of a man who had spent decades controlling courtrooms. There was nothing rushed or uncertain in his demeanor, despite the unusual circumstances of our meeting. "I appreciate you making time to see me," he began, exactly as if I had been the one to request the meeting rather than him. "Of course," I replied, matching his measured tone. "Though I confess I'm curious about the purpose of this conversation." "Judge." Harrington took a careful sip of his coffee, his expression revealing nothing. "I've always appreciated your directness, Julia. It's a quality that served you well as Richard's wife, though perhaps not always one he fully valued." The unexpected acknowledgement caught me off guard. Throughout my marriage to Richard, his father had always presented a united front with his son, never suggesting by word or expression that Richard might be anything less than exemplary as a husband. "Thank you," I said simply, waiting for him to continue rather than filling the silence. "I'll be equally direct," he said after a moment. "This situation with the Oakwood Heights property has created significant complications for all parties involved." I nodded, but offered no immediate response, using a technique I had observed him employ countless times in family discussions, the strategic pause that compelled others to elaborate. It worked. After a moment, he continued, "Richard informs me that you purchased the property through an LLC 5 years ago, without his knowledge, and that you've now terminated the rental agreement he signed under what he considers misleading circumstances." "That's partially accurate," I replied calmly. "I did purchase the property through my LLC 5 years ago, using funds from my separate property account as defined in our prenuptial agreement. As for the rental agreement, it was standard, transparent, and clearly worded. There was nothing misleading about it." The judge's expression remained neutral, but I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. Nevertheless, Richard feels he was not fully informed about the nature of the transaction. "With all due respect, Judge Harrington, your son is an attorney with 15 years of experience in property law. He signed a document without reading it carefully. That's regrettable, but it's hardly my responsibility." He studied me for a long moment, as if seeing me through new eyes. "You've changed, Julia." "Yes," I agreed simply. "I have." He took another sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving my face. "I've always respected you, you know. Even when Richard and I disagreed about certain choices you made, your insistence on maintaining your career at the museum, your reluctance to participate more actively in his political ambitions. This revelation was unexpected. During my marriage, Judge Harrington had never given any indication that he might take my side in disagreements with Richard, or that he recognized the sacrifices I had made. I wasn't aware of that, I said carefully. Ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, you wouldn't have been. Harrington men have a regrettable tendency to present a united front to the world, even when privately we might hold different views. The admission created a momentary shift in the atmosphere between us. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of honesty that had never characterized our relationship during my marriage to his son. I appreciate your candor, I said. But I assume you didn't request this meeting to share retrospective insights about my marriage. No, he acknowledged. I'm here because there's a way forward that could benefit everyone involved, if you're willing to consider it. And there it was, the real purpose of this unexpected olive branch. Not genuine reconciliation or acknowledgement of past wrongs, but a negotiating tactic. I'm listening, I said, my tone cooler than before. Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to ensure privacy despite the busy cafe around us. I'm retiring from the bench at the end of the year. It's not public knowledge yet, but the announcement will be made next month. This confirmed Michael's information, but hearing it directly from Judge Harrington gave it a weight and immediacy that transformed it from rumor to reality. Congratulations on your retirement, I said, offering the expected response while waiting for the other shoe to drop. Thank you. He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. The governor will appoint my replacement, of course. Richard is being considered for the position. I nodded, unsurprised by this revelation. I had heard rumors to that effect. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprised that I was already aware of this development. Then you understand why the current situation presents challenges. A public legal battle over property ownership, particularly one that hinges on a failure to properly review legal documents, would be problematic for his candidacy. I imagine it would be, I agreed, neither offering relief nor expressing satisfaction at this predicament. Judge Harrington studied me for a moment longer before continuing. Julia, I'm not here to threaten or pressure you. Those tactics might be Richard's approach, but they've never been mine. I'm here to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. Which is? You allow Richard and Vanessa to remain in the house until after the appointment process is complete, likely 4 to 6 months. In exchange, they will sign a formal acknowledgement of your ownership and agree to vacate the property at the end of that period without contest. Additionally, he added, his tone deliberate, I'm prepared to offer you a position on the Harrington Foundation Board, a role that would recognize your contributions to the arts community and provide you with significant influence over cultural funding in the region. The offer was shrewd, addressing both practical concerns about the house and offering professional rehabilitation after months of Richard's efforts to diminish my standing in the community. It was, by any objective measure, a generous compromise, but it also represented everything I had been fighting against since the divorce. The Harrington approach to problem-solving, where influence and position were currency, where conflicts were resolved through the strategic application of power rather than genuine recognition of right and wrong. That's a thoughtful proposal, I said carefully. May I ask why you're the one making it rather than Richard? Judge Harrington's expression shifted slightly, a brief flash of something that might have been disappointment. Richard can be stubborn, particularly when his pride is involved. He authorized me to negotiate on his behalf, but was reluctant to make the approach personally. I nodded, unsurprised. And Vanessa? Is she aware of this offer? She is, he confirmed. In fact, she was instrumental in convincing Richard to consider a compromise. This detail aligned with the vulnerability I had glimpsed during Vanessa's visit to my office. Perhaps she was indeed beginning to recognize aspects of Richard's character that had taken me years to fully comprehend. I took a moment to consider the offer, weighing it against my own priorities and principles. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm but resolute. I appreciate the proposal, Judge Harrington, and the respectful way you've presented it, but I'm afraid I must decline. Surprise registered briefly in his eyes before he masked it. May I ask why? It seems a reasonable compromise that would benefit all parties. Because accepting it would mean once again adjusting my life to accommodate Richard's ambitions and convenience, I explained quietly. It would mean allowing the Harrington family priorities to supersede my own, just as they did throughout my marriage. And most importantly, it would mean participating in a system where power and influence determine outcomes rather than principles and legitimate rights. Judge Harrington sat back slightly, his expression unreadable. I see. However, I continued, I'm willing to offer a different compromise. Richard and Vanessa may hold their engagement party at the house this weekend as planned. Following that, they will have until the end of the month, not 30 days, but the end of this calendar month, to vacate the property. I will make no public statements about the ownership situation unless directly asked, and even then, I will be discreet and avoid any mention of Richard signing documents without reading them. The judge considered this for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup. That's substantially less time than what we proposed. Yes, I agreed. But it's still a compromise from the original 30-day period, and it removes the risk of public embarrassment that Richard seems most concerned about. Another silence stretched between us as Judge Harrington weighed my counteroffer. Finally, he nodded once, a crisp movement that seemed to acknowledge both the terms and the shift in power they represented. I believe Richard will accept those terms, he said, his tone formal but not cold. I'll convey your offer and confirm his agreement by the end of the day. Thank you, I replied simply. As he prepared to leave, Judge Harrington paused, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. May I speak candidly, Julia? Not as Richard's father or as a judge, but simply as someone who has known you for 15 years? I nodded, curious despite my wariness. Richard made a grave mistake when he ended your marriage, he said quietly. One I suspect he will come to regret far more deeply than he currently realizes. The unexpected statement hung in the air between us, an acknowledgement I had never expected to hear from a man whose loyalty to his son had always seemed absolute. Thank you for saying that, I replied, genuinely touched by the admission. Judge Harrington nodded once more, then rose to leave. As he did, he extended his hand, a formal gesture, but one that carried a respect that had been absent in our previous interactions. I wish you well, Julia. Truly. I shook his hand, feeling the balance of power shift once more, not through confrontation or victory, but through the simple act of standing firmly in my own truth and worth. Likewise, Judge Harrington, I replied. Enjoy your retirement. As I watched him leave the cafe, I realized that for the first time in our 15-year acquaintance, we had met as equals rather than as patriarch and daughter-in-law. It was a small shift in the grand scheme of things, but one that represented everything I had been fighting to reclaim since the day Richard's text message had shattered my world. The weekend of Richard and Vanessa's engagement party arrived with a crystalline autumn clarity, the sky an impossible blue against the fiery colors of turning leaves. I had received formal confirmation from Judge Harrington that Richard had accepted my terms, grudgingly, I suspected, but accepted nonetheless. I had no intention of attending the party, of course. While I had granted permission for the event to proceed in my house, I drew the line at witnessing the celebration of their relationship. Instead, I planned a quiet evening at home with a new novel and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. The day of the party, however, brought an unexpected development in the form of a text message from Eleanor Blackwood, my real estate agent and friend. You might want to be available around 9 p.m. tonight. Trust me on this one. I stared at the cryptic message, uncertain what to make of it. Eleanor was not given to drama or intrigue, which made her mysterious suggestion all the more intriguing. After a moment's hesitation, I replied simply, "Should I be concerned?" Her response came almost immediately. Not concerned, just available. I'll call you. I spent the day in a state of mild curiosity, completing errands and household tasks, while occasionally wondering what Eleanor might have in mind. By evening, I had settled into my living room with my book and wine as planned, though I kept my phone close at hand. At precisely 9 o'clock, it rang. Eleanor, I answered, not bothering to hide my curiosity. What's going on? I'm at the party, she replied, her voice low as if she were speaking from somewhere private. At your house, Richard and Vanessa's engagement celebration. This was surprising. Though Eleanor had helped me purchase the property initially, I hadn't realized she was close enough to the couple to merit an invitation to their engagement party. Why? I asked, direct as always. I could almost hear her smile through the phone. Because Vanessa insisted on giving the guests a tour of their new home tonight. She's been showing off the renovations they've made, talking about their plans for future improvements. Very elaborate, very detailed, discussing how they'll convert one of the bedrooms into a nursery someday, the sunroom into Richard's home, office. My stomach tightened with an uncomfortable mixture of emotions. Anger at the presumption, discomfort at the mention of a nursery given my own unsuccessful attempts to have children with Richard, and confusion about why Eleanor thought I needed to know this. That's uncomfortable, I admitted, but I'm not sure why you're calling to tell me about it. Because, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping even lower, about 10 minutes ago, Judge Harrington arrived with his wife, and Vanessa, eager to impress her future father-in-law, immediately offered to show them the renovations they've made to the master suite. I waited, sensing there was more to this story. Julia, Eleanor said, a note of barely suppressed glee entering her voice. Judge Harrington stopped her mid-tour and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, Actually, Vanessa, I think you should be aware that this isn't your house to renovate. Julia owns this property. You and Richard are merely tenants with less than 2 weeks remaining on your lease. My breath caught. He said that? In front of everyone? Everyone, Eleanor confirmed. At least 15 people, including most of Richard's colleagues from the firm. You should have seen Vanessa's face. All the color drained out of it in an instant. And Richard. She paused, clearly savoring the moment. Richard looked like he'd been struck by lightning. I sat back against my couch, trying to process this unexpected twist. Judge Harrington had not only honored our agreement but had taken the additional step of publicly acknowledging my ownership in the most direct way possible. What happened next? I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity despite my mixed feelings about the situation. Chaos, Eleanor replied simply. Vanessa stammered something about a misunderstanding. Richard tried to pull his father aside, but the judge just looked at him and said, I think it's time for honesty, son. Then one of Richard's colleagues, Peterson, I think, asked if it was true, and the judge nodded and said something about respecting legitimate property rights regardless of personal relationships. The scene she described was so far beyond what I had anticipated that I found myself speechless. Judge Harrington had not merely conveyed my terms to Richard privately, he had effectively ended the charade Richard and Vanessa had been maintaining about the house in the most public way possible. The party's basically over now, Eleanor continued. People are making excuses and leaving. Richard disappeared into his study with the door closed. Vanessa is trying to maintain some semblance of hostess duties, but she looks shell-shocked. I didn't ask for this, I said quietly, more to myself than to Eleanor. I never wanted public humiliation for either of them. I know, Eleanor replied, her tone softening. But maybe this is what needed to happen, the truth coming out, with no opportunity for Richard to spin it afterward. She was right, of course. Had Judge Harrington not made this public declaration, Richard might have found a way to craft a narrative that preserved his dignity and professional reputation while quietly moving out of the house. Now, there would be no ambiguity, no room for manipulation of the facts. Thank you for letting me know, I said, still processing the implications of what had occurred. Of course, Eleanor replied. I should get back before anyone notices I'm missing, but I thought you deserved to know what happened. After we hung up, I sat motionless on my couch, the novel forgotten beside me. This very public revelation would undoubtedly complicate Richard's judicial aspirations, exactly what our agreement had been designed to prevent. Yet, Judge Harrington himself had been the one to create the situation. My phone chimed with a text message from Michael. Heard what happened at the party. You okay? News traveled fast in Westlake, especially when it involved the Harrington family. I typed back, I'm fine. Processing. How did you hear? His response came quickly. A colleague is there. Called me right after it happened. Want company? I considered the offer for a moment, then replied, Yes, I could use a friend right now. While waiting for Michael to arrive, I tried to untangle my complicated feelings about the evening's events. There was a certain vindication in Richard and Vanessa's public exposure, a satisfaction in knowing that the truth had been acknowledged, openly rather than hidden behind carefully crafted narratives. But there was also discomfort. I had never sought to humiliate them, only to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The public nature of tonight's revelation crossed a line from justice into something that felt uncomfortably like revenge, even though I hadn't orchestrated it. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened it to find Michael standing there, 2 containers of gelato in hand. A peace offering of sorts, or perhaps a celebration. I wasn't sure if this called for comfort food or celebration treats, he explained with a small smile. So I brought both? I stepped aside to let him in, grateful for his presence. I'm not entirely sure myself. We settled in my living room, the abandoned novel and wine joined by Michael's gelato offerings. For a few minutes, we sat in comfortable silence, both of us processing the evening's unexpected developments. So, Michael finally said, Judge, Harrington himself delivered the news. That's surprising. Extremely, I agreed, especially after our conversation where he emphasized the importance of discretion for Richard's judicial aspirations. Michael considered this, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that was the point. Maybe after meeting with you, he realized that Richard needed to face the consequences of his actions more directly. Or maybe, I suggested, he was simply tired of cleaning up his son's messes, of perpetuating the cycle where Richard acts impulsively and others manage the fallout. Either way, Michael said, it's a significant moment. After years of Richard controlling the narrative, about your marriage, the divorce, even the house, the truth is finally public, and it came from the most unimpeachable source possible. He was right, of course. No one in Westlake would question Judge William Harrington's word. His public acknowledgement of my ownership transformed what might have been dismissed as a bitter ex-wife's claim into an established fact. It feels strange, I admitted, taking a small spoonful of gelato. I've spent so long fighting to be heard, to have my version of events acknowledged, and now that it's happened, I'm not sure how to feel about it. Michael studied me for a moment. You're not enjoying their humiliation as much as you thought you might. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. No. It feels hollow somehow. Like watching someone you once loved fall from a great height. There's no satisfaction in it, only a strange sense of loss. That's because you're not vindictive by nature, Michael replied simply. Despite everything Richard did to you, you never wanted to destroy him. You just wanted what was rightfully yours. His understanding, so different from Richard's constant misinterpretation of my motives, warmed me in ways the wine and gelato couldn't. For perhaps the first time, I fully recognized the contrast between the relationship I had lost and the friendship that had sustained me through its aftermath. What happens now? Michael asked after another comfortable silence. They move out, as agreed, I replied. And I move forward. Into the house? He asked, his tone careful, neutral. I considered the question, which I had been asking myself for weeks. I'm not sure yet. Part of me wants to reclaim it, to finally live in the space I fell in love with all those years ago. But another part wonders if it might always carry the shadow of tonight, of the end of my marriage, of Richard and Vanessa's brief tenancy. Michael nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. You have time to decide. It's your house. You can take as long as you need to determine what role you want it to play in your life moving forward. My house. After months of legal maneuvering and emotional confrontation, those two simple words carried a weight and resonance that encompassed everything I had been fighting for. Not just physical ownership of a property, but ownership of my choices, my future, my narrative. As the evening progressed, Michael and I talked about lighter matters, upcoming exhibitions at the museum, a new restaurant downtown, a film we both wanted to see. The normalcy was comforting, a reminder that life continued beyond the drama of reclaiming my house and confronting my ex-husband. When Michael finally rose to leave, near midnight, I walked him to the door with a sense of peace I hadn't expected to feel on this tumultuous day. Thank you, I said simply. For being here tonight. For being here through all of it, really. He smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes in that way that had become increasingly familiar and welcome. Always, he replied, the single word carrying more meaning than an elaborate speech might have. After he left, I stood at my window for a long moment, looking out at the quiet street below. Somewhere across town, in my house, Richard and Vanessa were dealing with the aftermath of their public humiliation, their carefully constructed narrative shattered by Judge Harrington's unexpected intervention. But for the first time since receiving that 14-word text message that had ended my marriage, I wasn't defining my feelings or choices in relation to Richard. Instead, I was standing firmly in my own truth, neither seeking vengeance nor accepting diminishment. In that moment of clarity, I realized that true triumph wasn't about watching Richard and Vanessa's faces when they discovered the truth about the house. It wasn't about public vindication or even reclaiming physical property. True triumph was reclaiming myself, my dignity, my agency, my future, completely and without reservation. And that victory, unlike the hollow satisfaction of watching someone else fall, felt both substantial and sustaining. The week following the engagement party passed in a surreal blur. I threw myself into work at the museum, focusing on the upcoming winter exhibition rather than the whispers and glances that followed me whenever I ventured into public spaces around town. Word of Judge Harrington's revelation had spread quickly through Westlake's social circles, transforming me overnight. From Richard's abandoned ex-wife to the woman who owned Richard's dream house all along. It was a narrative shift I hadn't sought, but couldn't entirely escape. I hadn't heard directly from either Richard or Vanessa since the party, though Eleanor kept me updated on their activities at the house. According to her sources, the housekeeper, they'd hired primarily. They were packing methodically, room by room, the process apparently overseen by Vanessa, while Richard remained noticeably absent most days. Apparently, he's barely been home, Eleanor told me over lunch on Thursday. Vanessa's handling everything, the movers, the logistics, canceling the contractors they'd scheduled for additional renovations. She's quite efficient, I'll give her that. I nodded, uncomfortable with the topic despite my curiosity. Where are they moving to? A penthouse downtown, from what I've heard. Richard already owned it, an investment property he's had for years. Not as grand as Oakwood Heights, but prestigious in its own way. The information settled strangely in my chest. Another property I hadn't known about despite 15 years of marriage. Another secret kept. Another piece of evidence that Richard and I had lived parallel lives rather than a truly shared one. When will they be completely moved out? I asked, redirecting the conversation to practical matters. "The movers are scheduled for this Sunday," Eleanor replied. "Everything should be cleared by evening, well ahead of your end-of-month deadline." I nodded, relieved that at least this part of the process would be drama-free. "Good. That's good." Eleanor studied me over her salad, her expression softening. "Have you decided what you're going to do with the house once it's empty?" It was the question everyone seemed to be asking, directly or indirectly. What would I do with this property that had become the center of so much drama? Would I move in? Sell it? Rent it to someone else? Not yet, I admitted. I need to see it first, empty, without their presence or their renovations. I need to know if it still feels like mine, or if too much has changed. Eleanor nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. "I can arrange for the cleaners to go in Monday morning, after they've moved out. A deep clean, to remove any traces of their tenancy. Then perhaps you and I could walk through on Monday afternoon. No pressure, just an initial assessment." The thoughtfulness of her offer touched me. That would be perfect. Thank you, Eleanor. Our conversation shifted to other topics, but the impending walkthrough remained at the back of my mind for the rest of the week. I found myself both anticipating and dreading the moment when I would step back into the house, my house, without Richard and Vanessa's presence shaping the space. Sunday evening, I received a text from Eleanor. "All moved out. Cleaners confirmed. For 8 a.m. tomorrow. Meet at the house at 2?" I replied with a simple confirmation, then spent a restless night alternating between anticipation and anxiety. By morning, I had resigned myself to the emotional complexity of the day ahead and focused instead on practical preparations: comfortable shoes for walking through the large house, a notebook for any immediate observations or necessary repairs, a bottle of champagne for afterward, regardless of what I decided about the property's future. The day passed in a blur of work tasks intentionally scheduled to keep my mind occupied. Before I knew it, it was time to drive to Oakwood Heights for my first visit to the house as its empty, acknowledged owner. Eleanor was waiting for me in the circular driveway, her expression warm but professional. "The cleaners did an excellent job," she said as I approached. "It's immaculate inside." I nodded, my gaze drawn to the grand facade with its elegant Victorian detailing, the ornate trim work, the stained glass accents, the wide front porch that had first captured my imagination 6 years ago when we initially toured the property. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked gently. "As I'll ever be," I replied, drawing a deep breath before following her up the walkway. She unlocked the front door with a flourish, then stepped aside to allow me to enter first. "Welcome home, Julia. Officially." I stepped across the threshold, into the grand foyer, immediately struck by the quality of light streaming through the stained glass windows above the door. It cast jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor, exactly as I remembered from my first viewing of the property years ago. The house was indeed immaculate, but also strangely hollow, caught between its past as a historic property, its brief tenure as Richard and Vanessa's showcase, and its undefined future. I moved slowly from room to room, Eleanor following at a respectful distance, allowing me to absorb the space without commentary. In the living room, the modern art Vanessa had installed was gone, leaving faint outlines on the walls where it had hung. The sleek furniture had been removed, revealing the original herringbone hardwood floors that had been partially obscured by their oversized sectional sofa. The kitchen gleamed with high-end appliances they had installed, perhaps the one renovation I might keep. I noted mentally, but felt sterile without the warmth of everyday use. Upstairs, the master suite had been stripped of the designer bedding and dramatic light fixtures Vanessa had chosen, returning to its original proportions and architectural details. Standing in the center of the room, I tried to imagine myself living here, waking in this space, making it truly mine for the first time. It was as we were completing our tour, descending the grand staircase back to the foyer, that I noticed it, an envelope propped against the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. My name was written across the front in a flowing script I didn't recognize. "That wasn't there when I checked earlier," Eleanor said, frowning slightly. "The cleaners must have missed it." I picked up the envelope, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't sealed, merely folded closed. After a moment's hesitation, I opened it and withdrew a single sheet of expensive stationery. The note inside was brief, written in the same elegant handwriting as my name on the envelope. Julia. I thought about leaving without a word, but that felt like repeating Richard's mistake, ending something significant without proper acknowledgement. The house is yours, as it always was. I wish I could say I'm returning it in better condition than we found it, but the truth is more complicated. Some of our changes may be improvements in your eyes. Others may feel like violations of your vision for this space. Either way, I hope you find peace here, should you choose to stay, or closure, should you choose to leave it behind. Life is too short for bitterness. I'm learning that lesson earlier in my relationship with Richard than you did, for which I should perhaps thank. Here's Vanessa. I stared at the note, reading it twice more before handing it wordlessly to Eleanor, who skimmed it with raised eyebrows. "Well," she said finally, "that's unexpected." "Yes," I agreed, still processing the surprising glimpse into Vanessa's thoughts. There was no apology in the note, not explicitly, but there was an acknowledgement of reality and perhaps even a veiled warning about her relationship with Richard. For the first time, I found myself wondering about Vanessa not as the other woman or Richard's young girlfriend, but as an individual navigating her own complex relationship with a man whose capacity for sudden detachment I knew all too well. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked after a moment of silence. I folded the note carefully and returned it to its envelope. "I'm thinking that everyone in this situation is more complicated than I initially believed, including me." Eleanor smiled, slightly. "That's generally true of most situations in my experience." We completed our tour with a visit to the back gardens, which were dormant now in late autumn, but still showed the careful planning of the original landscape architect. The gazebo where Richard and Vanessa had planned to hold their wedding ceremony stood empty, and somehow forlorn among the bare trees and dried perennial beds. As we walked back to our cars, Eleanor asked the question I'd been considering throughout our tour. "So, what's your verdict? Will you make this your home, or is it time to let it go?" I looked back at the house, my house, with its graceful lines and rich history. The property I had fallen in love with, saved for, purchased secretly, lost temporarily, and finally reclaimed. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But for the first time, it feels like a genuine choice rather than a reaction to Richard or a statement about our marriage. And that's progress, I think." Eleanor nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. "Take your time. The house has stood for over a century. It can wait a little longer for you to decide its future, and yours." As I drove away from Oakwood Heights that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not of my journey, which continued to unfold in unexpected ways, but of this particular chapter. I had entered and exited the house on my own terms, neither seeking confrontation nor avoiding difficult emotions. It wasn't yet clear whether the Victorian mansion would become my home, or simply a stepping stone in my ongoing reconstruction of self. But for the first time since receiving Richard's text message 6 months ago, I felt fully capable of making that decision from a place of strength rather than reaction. Whatever came next would be my choice. My future. My dignified exit from the past we had shared, and my entry into a life that was entirely my own. The leaves had nearly all fallen by the time Michael and I met for our regular Sunday brunch at Westlake Cafe. a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally during the months following my divorce. The restaurant's patio had closed for the season, so we sat at our usual table by the window, watching occasional gusts of wind send the remaining leaves spiraling down to join their companions on the rain-dampened sidewalks. "You seem lighter today," Michael observed as we waited for our coffee. "More settled somehow." I smiled, recognizing the truth in his assessment. "I think I am. It's been 2 weeks since the walkthrough at Oakwood Heights. 2 weeks of not having to think about Richard or Vanessa or who owns what. It's peaceful." "Have you decided what you're going to do with the house?" he asked, the question gentle rather than pressing. It was a decision I'd been contemplating since that afternoon with Eleanor, turning the options over in my mind during quiet moments. "I'm leaning toward selling it," I admitted. "Not immediately, but eventually." Michael nodded, encouraging me to continue. "I love that house," I explained. "I always have, from the first moment I saw it, but I've realized that my attachment to it was partly about what it represented, the life I thought Richard and I would build there someday, the family we hoped to create." Our coffee arrived, providing a momentary pause in the conversation. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, gathering my thoughts. Without those expectations, without that imagined future, I continued, it's just a beautiful, historic property, one that deserves owners who will love it for what it is, not for what it symbolized in a marriage that no longer exists. Michael considered this, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds like a healthy perspective." "It feels healthy," I agreed. "For the first time since the divorce, I'm making decisions based on what I want for my future, not in reaction to my past with Richard." "So what do you want?" he asked, the question simple but profound. "For your future, I mean." I took a sip of my coffee, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to build a life that's authentically mine, not defined by being Richard's ex-wife or the woman who owned his dream house. Just me. Julia Coleman, museum curator, photography enthusiast, terrible baker but excellent gardener." Michael smiled at my self-description. "Sounds like a pretty great starting point." "What about you?" I asked, realizing that our conversations had often focused on my situation rather than his aspirations. "What do you want for your future?" He seemed momentarily caught off guard by the question, as if he wasn't accustomed to being asked about his own desires. "I want," he began, then paused, considering. "Professional satisfaction, yes. The firm is doing well, and I enjoy the work. But more than that, I want connection. Real connection, not the surface-level socializing that passes for relationship in too many circles." The honesty in his answer resonated with me. After years in the Harrington orbit, where social interactions were often strategic rather than genuine, I understood the hunger for authentic connection all too well. Our brunch arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As we ate, the discussion shifted to lighter topics, a documentary series we were both watching, an upcoming exhibition at the museum, plans for the holiday season that was rapidly approaching. It was only as we were finishing our meals that Michael circled back to our earlier topic. "There's something else you should know," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "About Richard." I tensed slightly, bracing myself for whatever new development was coming. "What now?" "The judicial appointment," Michael explained. "It's not happening. At least not this cycle." This was unexpected news. "Because of the house situation? The public revelation at the engagement party?" "Partially," Michael confirmed. "But there's more to it. Apparently, some irregularities came to light during the vetting process. Nothing criminal," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "But some questionable ethical choices in past cases. Clients who received preferential treatment. Cases settled under unusual circumstances." I processed this information slowly. During our marriage, I had occasionally heard whispers about Richard's aggressive tactics, his willingness to push boundaries in service of winning cases. But I had always dismissed these concerns, telling myself that all successful attorneys operated in gray areas sometimes. "How did you hear about this?" I asked. "The legal community in Westlake is small," Michael replied with a slight shrug. "Word gets around, especially when someone as prominent as Richard Harrington is passed over for an appointment everyone assumed was essentially guaranteed." I nodded, absorbing this new reality. "How is he taking it?" "Not well, from what I've heard. He's been absent from the firm more than usual, canceled court appearances, delegating cases to junior associates." A familiar knot of worry formed in my stomach, the reflexive concern for Richard's well-being that had been part of my emotional landscape for 15 years. I recognized it now for what it was, the lingering habit of a marriage that no longer existed, not a responsibility I needed to shoulder. "That's unfortunate," I said finally, "but not my problem anymore." Michael studied me for a moment, as if gauging whether my words reflected my true feelings. "No," he agreed softly. "It's not." The simple acknowledgement felt surprisingly freeing. Permission to release the last vestiges of responsibility for Richard's emotions and choices. For too long, I had oriented myself around his moods, his needs, his ambitions. Even after the divorce, I had continued to define my actions partly in relation to their impact on him. "You know," I said, the realization crystallizing as I spoke, "I think this is what healing actually feels like. Not the absence of pain or memories, but the freedom to acknowledge them without being controlled by them." Michael's smile was warm with understanding. "That sounds exactly right." As we left the cafe, walking together down the leaf-strewn sidewalk, I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for months. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs, and the town around me, the same streets and buildings I had walked past for years, somehow looked different, fresher, full of possibilities I hadn't previously recognized. "Do you have plans for the rest of the day?" Michael asked as we approached the corner where we would typically part ways. "Nothing specific," I replied. "Some work I brought home. Perhaps that novel I've been trying to finish for weeks." He hesitated briefly, then said, "I was planning to drive out to Lakeview Park this afternoon. The autumn colors along the hiking trails are supposed to be exceptional right now. Would you like to join me?" The invitation hung in the air between us, simple but laden with potential meaning. This wouldn't be our usual coffee or lunch meeting, the friendly support sessions that had sustained me through the divorce. This would be something chosen purely for enjoyment, for pleasure, for the simple desire to spend time together beyond the context of my healing process. It would be, I realized, a step toward whatever came next. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "Very much." The smile that spread across Michael's face, genuine, warm, perhaps even slightly relieved, mirrored the lightness I felt expanding in my own chest. Not the heady rush of new romance, but something steadier and more grounded. The quiet joy of connection built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. As we walked toward his car, our conversation flowing easily between topics, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. From the devastating text message that had ended my marriage to the complicated reclamation of my house, to this moment of simple, uncomplicated happiness, walking beside a man who saw me clearly and valued what he saw. The process hadn't been linear or neat. It had involved anger, grief, calculation, confrontation, vindication, and finally, release. I had lost a husband but found myself, lost a marriage but discovered my own strength, lost a dream but gained the freedom to create new ones, on my own terms. And perhaps most importantly, I had learned that emotional processing wasn't something to be rushed or avoided, but experienced fully, each stage acknowledged and honored for the lessons it contained, each feeling recognized as valid regardless of its complexity or inconvenience. Standing at the precipice of whatever came next, a new relationship perhaps, or simply a deepened friendship, a new home or a reimagined version of my current space, a life defined by its own contours rather than the shadow of what had been lost. I felt ready. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because I had finally granted it its proper place. As a chapter in my story, not the whole book. As Michael's car pulled away from the curb, carrying us toward an afternoon of autumn colors and easy conversation, I turned my face toward the sun breaking through the clouds, embracing both the warmth of the present moment and the promise of those yet to come. The winter months passed in a blur of quiet transformation. Outside, Westlake disappeared beneath a blanket of snow that softened its edges and muffled its sounds, while inside, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life that felt increasingly like my own creation rather than an adaptation to loss. The winter exhibition at the museum, my first major project since being reinstated as curator, opened to critical acclaim and record attendance. My downtown condo, once viewed as merely a transitional space following the divorce, had gradually become a true home, filled with books and artwork I loved, furniture chosen for comfort rather than impression, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her sense of self. And then there was Michael, whose presence in my life had evolved from supportive friend to something deeper, warmer. A relationship building not on the dramatic intensity of crisis, but on the steady foundation of mutual respect and genuine compatibility. It was a peaceful time, but not an isolated one. Even as I constructed this new life, ripples from the confrontation over the house continued to spread through the interconnected circles of Westlake society, occasionally washing back to touch my shores in unexpected ways. The first ripple arrived. On a snowy January evening, when I was working late at the museum preparing for a board presentation, my assistant appeared at my office door, her expression unusually hesitant. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Vanessa Mitchell." I looked up from my computer, genuinely surprised. I hadn't seen or spoken to Vanessa since before she and Richard had moved out of my house 3 months earlier. Did she say what this is about? No, just that it's personal rather than professional. I can tell her you're unavailable if you prefer. I considered this for a moment, curiosity eventually winning out over caution. No, it's all right. Please send her in. Moments later, Vanessa appeared in my doorway, as immaculately put together as always in a camel coat and designer boots appropriate for the snowy weather. Yet there was something different about her, a subtle shift in her demeanor, less polished confidence and more genuine uncertainty. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, remaining near the door as if uncertain of her welcome. "I won't take much of your time." "Please, sit down," I offered, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. Professional courtesy, if nothing else, demanded this much. She hesitated, then crossed to the chair and sat, her movements precise and controlled. Up close, I could see faint shadows beneath her eyes, partially concealed by expertly applied makeup, but visible nonetheless. "I won't pretend this isn't awkward," she began, meeting my gaze directly. "But there are things I think you deserve to know, and I'm not sure anyone else will tell you." The statement immediately put me on alert. "About Richard?" She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, about Richard, about our relationship, about the patterns I've begun to recognize." Something in her tone, a mixture of resignation and dawning awareness, resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. It was the voice of a woman coming to terms with difficult truths about someone she loved. "I'm listening," I said, my initial, wariness softening slightly. Vanessa drew a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Richard and I are no longer together. The engagement is off." Though surprised, I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, the polite response coming automatically. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Are you? You have every right not to be." "Contrary to what you might believe," I replied carefully, "I've never wished unhappiness on either of you. Accountability, yes. Suffering, no." She studied me for a moment, as if reassessing her preconceptions. "That's generous, given the circumstances." I shrugged slightly. "What happened between you and Richard?" "The same thing that happened between you and Richard, I suspect," she answered, her voice taking on an edge of bitter recognition. "Just accelerated. The gradual withdrawal of genuine attention. The increasing criticism masked as helpful suggestions. The subtle undermining of confidence. And eventually, the emotional detachment." Her description was so eerily familiar, so precisely aligned with my own experience during the final years of my marriage, that I felt a chill run through me, despite the warmth of my office. "How long?" I asked softly. 3 months, she replied. "Things started to change after the engagement party, after your ownership of the house was revealed. At first I thought it was just wounded pride, the embarrassment of the public revelation. But it became something more, a fundamental shift in how he viewed me." I nodded, understanding all too well. "Because you had witnessed his vulnerability, his mistake." "Exactly," she confirmed, a flash of surprise crossing her features at my immediate comprehension. Suddenly, I wasn't the perfect partner anymore. I was someone who had seen him fail, who knew he wasn't infallible. And that was unacceptable to him, apparently. The parallels to my own experience were striking. Throughout our marriage, Richard had systematically distanced himself from anyone who witnessed his moments of weakness or failure, be they colleagues, friends, or even family members. I had been the sole exception, until I wasn't. Did he end things? Or did you? I asked, curiosity overcoming my usual restraint. "I did," she said, a hint of pride entering her voice. 3 weeks ago, after I found text messages on his phone, conversations with a paralegal at his firm. History repeating itself, it seems. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet somehow it did. Not that Richard had found someone new. That pattern was well established, but that he had been so careless, so predictable in his methods. "I'm truly sorry, Vanessa," I said, meaning it despite our complicated history. "No one deserves that kind of betrayal." She nodded, accepting the sympathy without comment. For a moment we sat in silence. 2 women connected by the unexpected bond of loving and losing the same flawed man. "There's something else you should know," she continued finally. "Something that might affect you more directly. Richard has been struggling professionally since the judicial appointment fell through. His behavior at the firm has become erratic. Missed deadlines, canceled court appearances, conflicts with colleagues." I frowned, concerned despite myself. That doesn't sound like Richard. Whatever his personal failings, he's always been meticulous. About his professional responsibilities. "That's changing," Vanessa said grimly. "And there are rumors of a malpractice investigation related to a case he handled last year, something about failure to disclose evidence. I don't know the details, but it sounds serious." The information settled uneasily in my stomach. Richard's career had always been the cornerstone of his identity, the framework around which he built his sense of self-worth. If that was crumbling, "Why are you telling me this?" I asked directly. "We're not friends, Vanessa. Our only connection is a man who hurt us both." She met my gaze, her expression surprisingly vulnerable. "Because I've spent months thinking about what you said that day in your office. About ownership. About reclaiming your life. About refusing to be defined by Richard's actions or narrative. And I realized I wanted that too. To move forward with clarity and dignity, not bitterness and secrets." Her answer resonated with unexpected depth. Despite our different positions in Richard's life, despite the pain and conflict between us, we shared this fundamental human desire to emerge from betrayal not diminished, but somehow more authentically ourselves. And, she added after a moment, I wanted to warn you that Richard might reach out to you soon. In the past week, he's mentioned you several times, always after he's been drinking, which is increasingly often. He seems fixated on the idea that you orchestrated his professional downfall, that everything started falling apart after the house situation. I sighed, unsurprised but weary of being cast as the villain in Richard's personal mythology. I had nothing to do with any investigations into his professional conduct. I know that, Vanessa said quickly. And rationally, I think he knows it, too. But he's looking for someone to blame, someone to focus his anger on, and you're convenient. The warning was well-intentioned, I realized. Whatever complications existed in our shared history, Vanessa was genuinely trying to prepare me for potential confrontation with an increasingly unstable ex-husband. Thank you for telling me, I said sincerely. I appreciate the warning. She nodded, then rose to leave. Our strange impromptu meeting apparently concluded. At the door, she paused, turning back with a hesitant expression. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I'm sorry for my role in hurting you. Not for loving. Richard, I can't apologize for my feelings, but for the cruelty at the housewarming party, for the deliberate humiliation. That was unnecessary. Unkind. The apology, unexpected and seemingly genuine, caught me off guard. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. Thank you, I said finally. I appreciate that. She nodded once more, then disappeared through the door, leaving me alone with the ripple effects of her revelations. I sat motionless at my desk for several minutes after she left, processing this unexpected development. Richard's professional struggles, his increasing instability, his potential resentment toward me. None of it was my responsibility, yet all of it affected me in subtle, indirect ways. The interconnected nature of our lives, even after divorce, was an unavoidable reality in a town the size of Westlake. His reputation reflected on mine, just as my reclamation of the house had impacted his standing. We were no longer married, but we remained caught in each other's orbits, influencing each other's lives through the complex social ecosystem we both inhabited. Later that evening, I called Michael to share the unexpected visit. His immediate concern was for my safety, a reaction that warmed me even as I assured him it was unnecessary. Richard has many flaws, I said, but he's never been violent or physically threatening. People change, Michael replied, his voice serious. Especially when they're under extreme stress or turning to alcohol more frequently. Promise me you'll be cautious if he does reach out. I agreed, touched by his protective instinct, but confident in my ability to handle whatever confrontation might be coming. The woman Richard had left via text message 6 months ago, uncertain, devastated, struggling to reclaim her sense of self, was not the woman I was now. The following week brought the second significant ripple effect, this one, in the form of an email from Judge William Harrington. The subject line was simple: property inquiry. Julia. I hope this message finds you well. My retirement becomes official next month, and Martha and I have begun considering our next chapter. We're planning to downsize from our current residence, which has become unnecessarily large for just the two of us. During this process, my thoughts have turned repeatedly to the Victorian property on Oakwood Heights. I've always admired the architecture and historical significance of that house, even when Richard was dismissive of its potential years ago. If you have not yet determined your long-term plans for the property, I would like to inquire whether you might consider selling it to Martha and me. We would, of course, offer fair market value plus a premium to acknowledge the property's special significance. Please understand that this inquiry comes from Martha and me personally, not on Richard's behalf. In fact, he is unaware of our interest, and we would prefer to keep it that way for the time being, given the complicated history involved. I've always respected your integrity and directness, which is why I'm approaching you openly about this possibility. If you're not interested in selling at this time, I completely understand and will not raise the matter again. Sincerely, William Harrington. I read the email twice, surprised by both its content and its respectful tone. The irony was impossible to miss. Richard's father expressing interest in the very house his son had initially dismissed, then desperately tried to claim, and finally lost in a public humiliation. The request required careful consideration. Selling. To the Harringtons would create yet another complex connection to my former in-laws, at a time when I was finally establishing independence from their family. Yet there was something appealing about the possibility of the house being owned by people who genuinely appreciated its historical significance and architectural integrity. After several days of reflection, I composed a thoughtful response. Judge Harrington, thank you for your email and your interest in the Oakwood Heights property. I appreciate your directness and the respect with which you've approached this matter. I have indeed been considering selling the house, though I haven't yet listed it publicly. While I love the property, I've come to realize that it represents a chapter of my life that is now complete. I would be open to discussing a potential sale to you and Martha. However, I would need assurances that this transaction would remain strictly between us, with no involvement from Richard, either during the process or afterward regarding access to the property. If you're amenable to these conditions, perhaps we could meet for coffee next week to discuss the possibility further. Regards, Julia Coleman. His reply came the same day, agreeing to my conditions and suggesting a meeting time. The potential sale represented yet another unexpected turn in the winding path that had begun with Richard's betrayal, a fitting symmetry that might finally close the circle on that chapter of my life. As winter began to yield to early spring, these ripple effects continued to spread in unpredictable ways. Richard's professional struggles became public knowledge when he took an unexpected leave of absence from the firm. Vanessa relocated to Chicago for a position with a prestigious marketing agency, a clean break from both Richard and the whispers that had followed their broken engagement, and I continued to build my new life, deepening my relationship with Michael, excelling in my role at the museum, finalizing negotiations with Judge Harrington and Martha for the sale of the Oakwood Heights property. Each development represented not just a change in circumstance, but a shift in identity and relationship, mine and others, creating a complex web of consequences that extended far beyond the moment Richard had pressed send on that life-altering text message. The ripple effects weren't simply consequences or outcomes. They were transformations, both subtle and profound. No one involved, not me, not Richard, not Vanessa, not even the Harringtons, emerged unchanged from the conflict over the house and all it represented. Some transformations were painful, others liberating. Some connections were irrevocably broken, while new ones formed in unexpected places. But all of them, collectively, illustrated a fundamental truth I had been learning throughout this journey: that even our most private betrayals and victories create ripples that touch countless shores beyond our own. 1 year to the day after receiving Richard's 14-word text message ending our marriage, I stood in the empty foyer of the Oakwood Heights house for the last time. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass accents above the door, casting jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor, just as it had the first time I'd toured the property all those years ago. The closing on the sale to Judge Harrington and Martha was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Tonight was my final opportunity to say goodbye to the house that had played such a pivotal role in my journey from devastated ex-wife to the woman I had become. I moved slowly through the rooms, each one echoing with emptiness, yet somehow full of memory. In the grand living room, I remembered my first vision of how it could look with the right furniture and art. In the kitchen, I recalled planning elaborate dinner parties that would never happen. In the master bedroom, I had once imagined peaceful mornings and intimate evenings in a marriage that had already been quietly fracturing beneath the surface of my awareness. Yet alongside these bittersweet recollections were newer, stronger memories. Standing my ground against Richard's intimidation tactics in the study. Watching Vanessa's confidence crumble when she learned the truth about ownership. Walking through the empty rooms with Eleanor after they moved out, reclaiming the space as truly my own. The house had witnessed both my deepest disappointments and my most empowering moments of growth. Letting it go felt less like a loss and more like a conscious, deliberate release, a recognition that its role in my story was complete. My phone chimed with a text message from Michael. "Finished at work? Still meeting at the house? I can bring dinner." I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. Michael had understood my need for this final, private goodbye to the property, offering to join me afterward to help mark the transition with our own small ritual of closure. As I waited for his arrival, I wandered out to the back garden, where early spring bulbs were pushing through the soil in defiance of the occasional lingering frost. New life emerging from winter's dormancy seemed an appropriate metaphor for my own journey over the past year. The sound of the front door opening announced Michael's arrival. Moments later, he appeared on the back porch, a picnic basket in one, hand and a bottle of champagne in the other. "I thought we could have our own private farewell party," he explained with a smile. "A proper goodbye to the house, but also a celebration of everything that's happened since you reclaimed it." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched me deeply. This was the fundamental difference between Richard and Michael. One had viewed me as an extension of himself, while the other saw and respected me as a complete, independent person with my own emotional needs and journey. "It's perfect," I said, meeting him on the porch steps. "Thank you." We spread a blanket on the wooden floor of the gazebo, the same structure where Richard and Vanessa had planned to hold their wedding ceremony, now reclaimed as the setting for our private celebration. Michael unpacked the basket, revealing an assortment of my favorite foods: crusty bread, artisanal cheeses, olives, fresh fruit, and chocolate truffles from the bakery downtown. As we ate, surrounded by the deepening twilight of early spring, our conversation flowed easily between memories, observations, and plans for the future. There was none of the careful self-editing I had practiced during my marriage to Richard, no anxiety about expressing opinions that might contradict his or reveal weaknesses he could later use against me. "Do you regret selling?" Michael asked. As we finished the meal, his question gentle rather than probing. I considered this thoughtfully, gazing at the Victorian mansion silhouetted against the darkening sky. "No," I replied finally. "It feels right. The house served its purpose in my life. Multiple purposes, really. It taught me about my own capacity for independent action, about standing my ground, about reclaiming what's mine." I paused, sipping my champagne before continuing. "But it's also entangled with too much history. My marriage to Richard, his betrayal, the conflict over ownership. I'm ready for something that's purely mine, without those complicated associations." Michael nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. "Have you decided what you're looking for? In your next home, I mean." The question prompted a smile, as it reminded me of the research I'd been quietly conducting over the past few weeks. "Actually, I have some ideas. I've been looking at properties downtown, not condos like my current place, but one of those historic townhouses near the museum. Something with character but more manageable than Oakwood Heights. A place I can really make my own." "That sounds perfect for you," he said, his expression warm with genuine interest rather than the polite attention Richard would have offered before redirecting the conversation to his own priorities. As darkness settled around us, Michael reached into the picnic basket once more and withdrew a small wrapped package. "I brought something else," he said, offering it to me. "A farewell gift for the house, but also a recognition of everything this year has meant." Curious, I unwrapped the package to find a beautifully crafted wooden box. Inside, nestled on velvet, was a vintage key, not to this house or any real door, but an ornate antique skeleton key that seemed to belong in a fairy tale rather than a modern lock. "It's symbolic," Michael explained as I lifted it from the box. "Not a key to lock anything away, but to unlock whatever comes next. Your future, your choices, your life. Entirely yours to discover and create." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought unexpected tears to my eyes. In its simple metaphor, it captured exactly what this journey had ultimately been about. Not the house itself, but the reclamation of my power to shape my own life. "It's perfect," I said softly. "Thank you." As we packed up our impromptu picnic and prepared to leave the house for the final time, I paused in the foyer for one last look. The space that had once represented my dreams of a future with Richard, then become the battlefield for a painful reckoning after his betrayal, now felt peaceful. A chapter completed, its lessons integrated, its purpose fulfilled. Outside, the spring evening was cool but not cold, the air filled with the promise of renewal. Michael loaded our picnic things into his car, while I locked the front door for the last time, the key that would soon belong to Judge Harrington and Martha secure in an envelope in my purse. "Ready?" Michael asked as I joined him at the car. The question felt weighted with meaning beyond this moment. Was I ready, not just to leave this house, but to fully embrace whatever came next? To continue building a life defined by my own choices, rather than in reaction to Richard's betrayal? "Yes," I said simply, the truth of it resonating through me with quiet certainty. "I'm ready." As we drove away from Oakwood Heights, I didn't look back at the mansion receding in the distance. Instead, my gaze remained forward, focused on the road ahead and the man beside me who had supported my journey without trying to direct it. The transformation that had begun with 14 devastating words in a text message had culminated not just in reclaiming a house, but in reclaiming myself, my autonomy, my confidence, my capacity for genuine connection uncompromised by fear or accommodation. I had emerged from the wreckage of my marriage not diminished, but expanded, not hardened, but more authentically myself. The woman who had once shaped herself to fit Richard's expectations and tolerated his subtle undermining, now stood firmly in her own truth, unwilling to compromise her worth for anyone's convenience or comfort. This was the true victory, far more significant than temporary satisfaction of watching Richard and Vanessa discover who really owned their dream home. The house had been a catalyst, a crucible, a tangible representation of the intangible transformation occurring within me. Now, as spring breathed new life into Westlake and I prepared to close this chapter definitively, I recognized that the most important ownership I had reclaimed wasn't of Victorian architecture and historic grounds, but of my own story, my own values, and my own future. Whatever came next, whether in my career, my relationship with Michael, or the new home I would eventually find, it would be shaped not by reaction to past wounds, but by authentic desires and conscious choices. The betrayal that had once seemed like an ending had proven instead to be a beginning, painful and unwelcome, yes, but ultimately transformative in ways I could never have imagined on that devastating day 1 year ago. As we turned onto the main road leading downtown, Michael reached across to take my hand, a simple gesture of connection that required no words. I interlaced my fingers with his, grateful for his presence but equally grateful for my own hard-won strength that allowed me to choose this relationship rather than cling to it from fear or need. The antique key he had given me rested in my purse, beside the practical one I would surrender tomorrow at the closing. One key opening the way to something new, the other closing the door on something completed. Both equally necessary, both part of the continuous unfolding of a life reclaimed. Richard had betrayed me after 15 years together, and his new wife had indeed discovered who really owned their dream home. But the true revelation, the one that would carry me forward long after the drama of property ownership faded into memory, was the discovery of who I really was behind the roles I had played for so long. And that woman, I now knew with unshakable certainty, was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.